I needed to get away. Work had been draining me for months. Every day felt the same. Early mornings, long commutes, noise, meetings, emails, pressure, and that hollow silence at night when I stared at the ceiling, wondering where the time had gone. My mind felt like it was trapped in a constant loop. I couldn't sleep well, I couldn't focus, and every small problem felt bigger than it really was. I'd started biting my nails again, and my appetite dropped without me noticing. I didn't want to talk to anyone about it. I didn't need anyone's advice. I just needed space. That's when I found this listing for an off-grid cabin up north, deep in the woods of British Columbia. It wasn't on Airbnb or any popular site. It was listed on a quiet travel forum by someone who said they had inherited it but didn't have time to use it. There were only a few blurry pictures. A small wooden structure, surrounded by trees, with a creek nearby and no neighbors for miles. No internet, no cell service, with stove for heat, solar power for a little light, a water pump and a gas generator if needed. Sounded perfect. I emailed the guy. He replied fast, told me it was free to use as long as I respected the place and left it clean. I just needed to bring my own food, bedding, and anything else I needed. A week later, I was driving 6 hours north with a cooler, a couple blankets, and a backpack full of books. I didn't even tell my coworkers I was going. I said I needed personal time. They didn't ask questions. The road to the cabin was rough. The last 30 minutes were on a dirt path barely wide enough for one vehicle. My car bounced and rattled over the rocks, mud, and uneven ground. Trees pressed in close from both sides. I had to slow down to a crawl and keep both hands tight on the wheel. Finally, I saw it. The cabin sat alone in a clearing. The sun was low behind it, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The place looked old but solid. Weathered wood, a sloped metal roof, a stone chimney. A wooden porch with 2 chairs and an axe leaned against the side. There were tall pines all around, and behind the cabin, the forest dropped down toward the sound of rushing water. Probably the creek I'd seen on the map. I parked beside the porch, stepped out, and stretched. The air was cold but clean. I could smell pine, dirt, and something faintly sweet. It was quiet, the kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. No engines, no people, not even birds just then. I unlocked the door with the key the guy had mailed me and stepped inside. The air inside was dry and smelled like old wood and dust. The cabin was one big room, except for a small closed door on the left side I assumed was the bathroom. There was a bed with a bare mattress, a wood stove, a small table, a couple chairs, and a shelf with canned goods and old tools. There were a few windows, but they were small and set high in the walls. They let in enough light to see, but not enough to make the place feel warm. I unpacked my things, laid out my sleeping bag and pillow on the mattress, stacked my food in a cooler by the wall, set my flashlight on the table. I filled a pitcher from the water pump outside, boiled some on the stove, and made instant noodles. I sat in one of the chairs and ate slowly, watching the sky grow darker through the windows. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The days that followed were simple. I woke up with the sun. I cooked basic meals, canned soup, rice, beans. I read for hours, took long walks through the woods, sat by the creek and watched the water move over the rocks. Sometimes I just sat on the porch and did nothing. There was no signal, no internet, no distractions. I kept my phone turned off and in my bag. I chopped firewood when I needed more heat, used the outhouse behind the cabin when necessary, and fell asleep early. My mind started to settle. My shoulders didn't feel so tight all the time. The constant ringing in my ears I thought was stress started to fade. The third day, I found something strange. It was early afternoon, and I was cleaning out the corner of the cabin where a few old chairs had been stacked. I was just trying to make the place tidier. I moved the chairs, swept up the dust, and noticed a square seam in the floorboards. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It was maybe 3 feet wide on each side. The boards formed a perfect square. I tapped it with the handle of the broom. It sounded hollow. I kneeled and ran my fingers along the edges. There was a small metal ring sunk into one of the boards, almost flush with the surface. I tugged on it. The panel lifted with some effort. It was heavier than I expected. Beneath it, a set of narrow wooden stairs led straight down into darkness. The air from below was cooler and smelled damp, like earth and mildew. There was no light switch that I could see. I got my flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it down the steps. The beam lit up a cramped room below. Bare wood walls, stone floor, and what looked like shelves, tools, and old boxes stacked along the walls. I hesitated. My heart was beating a little faster, but I wasn't scared, just curious. I climbed down slowly, careful not to slip. The wood creaked under my weight, but it held. The basement, or whatever it was silent. The air was heavy, stale. My flashlight's beam bounced off cobwebs and dust. There were old jars on the shelves, empty crates, tools with rusted metal and wooden handles, a coil of rope, a broken lantern, and a couple rolled-up maps sat on a table pushed against one wall. I walked around, shining the light into every corner. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But then I noticed something odd. On the far side of the basement, behind a stack of crates, part of the wooden wall looked different. The boards were cleaner, less dust. The nails were newer, silver instead of rusted, like someone had replaced just that section recently. I moved the crates aside. They were heavy and left scrape marks in the dust-covered floor. Behind them, the wall had a narrow door, just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. The door didn't have a knob. It was just a plank of wood with a slot at the edge for fingers. I pulled it open slowly. Behind it, a tunnel stretched into the darkness. I froze. It was narrow and low, with wooden beams holding up the sides. Dirt walls. The air that came out smelled stronger, earthy, cold, and slightly metallic. I stood there for a long time, just staring. I didn't go in. Not that day. Instead, I backed out, replaced the crates, climbed up the stairs, and closed the trapdoor. I made sure it was sealed tight. I didn't want anything coming up. Not animals, not air, not anything. That night, I couldn't sleep as well. I kept thinking about that tunnel. Why was it there? Who built it? Where did it go? The next morning, I tried to ignore it. I went for a long hike, farther than I had before, through thick trees and rocky hills. But my mind kept circling back to that tunnel like a moth to a flame. By the time I got back to the cabin, I had decided. I was going to explore it. I waited until the sun was high and the light coming in through the windows was strong. I opened the trapdoor again, climbed down, and cleared the crates away. I had my flashlight, a backup battery, and a knife on my belt. Not that I really expected to need it, but it felt better than having nothing. I crouched and stepped into the tunnel. The floor was dirt, uneven and cold. The walls were close. I had to walk slightly hunched, and every few feet, I had to step over broken wood or duck under low beams. The deeper I went, the colder it got. After maybe 20 steps, the tunnel curved to the right and opened up into a small chamber. It was maybe 15 feet wide and circular. The walls were stone, set by hand. There were more shelves, a table, and something that looked like a workbench. Old tools were laid out. A rusted hammer, screwdrivers, nails, even what looked like surgical instruments. But the thing that made my skin crawl was what I found in the corner. A metal frame, about the size of a twin bed. Straps on the sides. Dried stains on the metal and on the concrete below it. Beside it, a small table with chains, locks, and a stained cloth that had long since dried and hardened. It looked like someone had used this room for something awful. Suddenly, the silence pressed in on me like a weight. I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears, the slow drip of water from somewhere in the wall. I didn't stay long. I turned around and got out of there, fast but careful. When I reached the stairs, I slammed the trapdoor shut behind me, threw a chair over it, and just stood there, sweating. It wasn't fear of ghosts or monsters. It was the kind of fear that comes when you know another human being had done something deeply wrong in that space. That night, I barely slept, and I didn't sleep the next one either. On the 5th night, I woke to the sound of wood creaking. Not from the stove, not from wind, from inside, from below. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I didn't move for a long time. I just listened. The sound didn't come again. The next day, I packed up, I cleaned everything. I was burned out. That was the only way to put it. Work was chewing me up. I had been grinding for months without a proper break, and everything felt loud. City traffic, buzzing phones, even small talk in elevators. My chest felt heavy all the time. I couldn't focus, and I was sleeping less and less. I didn't tell anyone, but one night I almost drove straight through a red light because I was so spaced out. That scared me, so I took a month off and decided to go away somewhere silent, far away from everything. I wanted to be alone to clear my head. I didn't want people or phones or emails. I just wanted silence and nature. That was it. I found a small cabin listing online. It was in the Appalachian Mountains, way up north, at least 20 miles from the nearest small town. It didn't even show up properly on Google Maps. The photos were basic, just a wooden structure with a deck, a fireplace, a bed, a small kitchen, and a view that stretched over dense forest. It didn't have Wi-Fi, no phone service either. That sounded perfect. I packed my things: warm clothes, canned food, bottled water, a couple of books, some tools, batteries, a flashlight, and a big first aid kit. I even brought a small solar charger for emergencies. I filled my SUV with everything I thought I might need and drove out there. The last stretch of road wasn't really a road. It was more like a muddy path with tire tracks between trees. I drove for nearly 45 minutes through that forest after leaving the main highway, sometimes creeping at 5 miles per hour just to keep from getting stuck. It had rained the night before, so the tires slipped more than once. But eventually, the trees cleared, and I saw the cabin. It was just like the pictures, small, square, solid. It sat right on the edge of a steep slope, with the forest stretching endlessly below. You could see mountain ridges in the distance, dark and endless. I parked beside it, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't hear anything. No engines, no people, no phones, just trees moving slightly in the breeze and the occasional distant bird. The place had a kind of silence that pressed down on you. Not in a bad way at first. It was just pure, still quiet. I unloaded my gear, checked the place out. It had been stocked with dry firewood, just like the owner promised, and it was clean enough. The door locked with a simple bolt, the windows were all intact, and the little propane stove worked. The first few days were everything I needed. I slept for almost 12 hours the first night. I drank hot coffee on the deck every morning and read until the sun went down. I took short hikes around the cabin during the day, nothing too far, just far enough to move my legs. I chopped some wood, made small fires at night, and just sat there listening to nothing. I didn't keep track of the days that well, but I think it was about the 4th or 5th day when I first noticed something strange. It wasn't anything big. I was out behind the cabin, checking a small trail I had found the day before. It looked like it had once been used, maybe by hunters or someone else who knew the land, but it was overgrown. As I was walking, I noticed that some branches up ahead looked freshly broken. Not by wind or animals, snapped, recently. They were green inside still, and a few were hanging by threads. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. No sound, no movement. I didn't think too much of it. Maybe a deer came through or something. Still, it felt recent, like it had just happened. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. I kept thinking about those branches. It wasn't like I was scared, but my mind just kept circling back to it. I finally fell asleep around 2 in the morning. The next morning, I went out to collect some kindling and firewood from a pile I had made earlier in the week. It had been covered with a tarp, but when I got there, the tarp was half off and some of the smaller branches were scattered around. A few were broken in half. That bothered me. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I kept walking around the cabin slowly, checking for signs of an animal. I didn't see tracks, not even scat. But about 10 feet into the trees, I saw something else. It was a footprint, a boot print, not mine. It was facing the cabin. It was faint, but it was there, in a patch of softer earth between some roots. I stared at it for a long time, just standing still. Then I looked around me slowly. There wasn't another sound, just wind. I didn't panic, but I felt something twist in my gut. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door, and stood at the window for a while. I didn't see anything. I told myself it might have been from before I got there. Maybe the owner or another guest. Still, it didn't sit right. That night, I lit the fireplace and kept a flashlight close. I stayed inside. I tried to read, but every little sound outside pulled my attention. A creak, a rustle, something tapping. I told myself it was wind and branches, but I still kept the bolt on the door locked and slept with a small hatchet beside the bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound, something sharp. It wasn't inside, not exactly. It sounded like it was right outside one of the windows. It was a short, quick sound like wood snapping, not loud but close. I didn't move for a long time. I just lay there, breathing slow, heart hammering. I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight. I clicked it on and aimed it toward the window. Nothing, just empty trees and darkness. I got up and walked to the front door. I didn't open it, I just stood behind it and listened. Nothing moved, not for a while. I waited until morning before going out again. I walked the entire perimeter of the cabin. I checked the windows. I looked at the ground near the edge of the deck, and I found something. A small piece of torn black fabric caught on a branch. It looked like it came from a jacket, not mine. This time, I felt it more clearly. That tight feeling in my stomach, like something was wrong and getting worse. I didn't have a phone signal and there was no landline. I had a radio that could catch weather updates, but it wasn't strong enough to reach help. I considered leaving that day, but the road was muddy again from light rain overnight. If I got stuck halfway down, I'd be worse off. So I decided to stay one more night, but I'd leave at first light no matter what. That day, I stayed alert. I didn't wander into the trees. I kept the hatchet on me. I sat on the deck most of the afternoon watching, but nothing happened. Then, just before sunset, I saw something down the slope. It was far, but I could make it out between trees. A figure, standing still, not walking, just standing. I froze. It wasn't moving toward me, not yet, but it was watching the cabin. I was sure of it. I ducked behind the railing, heart racing. When I peeked again, the figure was gone. I went back inside, locked the door, and pulled one of the chairs in front of it. I blocked the back door with the table. I covered the windows with blankets. I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, flashlight in my lap, listening. I didn't sleep that night. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard footsteps. I know what footsteps on wooden boards sound like. The deck creaked once, then again slow, heavy steps. Whoever it was walked along the edge of the cabin. I could hear them outside the walls. I didn't breathe. Then silence. And then the door handle moved. It didn't rattle. It didn't shake. Turned slowly. But it couldn't open because of the bolt. After a few seconds, it stopped. I sat there, frozen. Then footsteps again, walking away this time. I stayed in that spot until sunrise. When the sun came up, I packed everything fast. I threw it all into the SUV and didn't even care how neat it was. I drove down the mountain, slipping in mud, almost skidding twice. But I didn't stop. When I finally reached a gas station near the town, I went in and used their phone to call the police. I told them someone had been near the cabin, maybe trying to break in. They asked if I had seen a face. I hadn't. They said they'd send someone up to check. That was the last I heard. I didn't go back for the deposit. I didn't even message the cabin owner. I didn't care. I just wanted out. A few weeks later, I saw a small local news article online. It said police found signs that someone had been squatting in old hunting shelters deep in that part of the forest. Not cabins, not official structures, just old lean-tos and makeshift camps. They didn't say who, just that people were probably living up there illegally off the grid. No arrests, no names. I still wonder if whoever was outside that night even knew I was just a regular person trying to be alone, or if they had come looking for someone they thought wouldn't be missed. I haven't gone back to any cabins since then. I still like the idea of nature, of quiet, but I'll never be that far off-grid again. The silence out there wasn't peaceful, not after a while. It started to feel like something was waiting inside it, watching, and sometimes, even now, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear slow footsteps on a wooden deck. But there's no deck outside my apartment. At least not anymore. I had been feeling burnt out for a while. Work had become too much, and even though I had no real family responsibilities and no one close to me at the time, I still felt like I couldn't breathe in the city anymore. The noise, the constant pressure, the crowds, everything felt tight, like something invisible was pushing down on my chest every day. I didn't know exactly what I needed, but I knew I had to get away from everyone and everything, even if it was just for a few days. That's why I booked the cabin. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. A friend from high school had mentioned it on a Facebook post, said they knew a guy who owned a small place out in the woods of northern Idaho. It was a private thing, no listing, no website. The kind of deal where you just send the guy a message, Venmo him a small fee, and he sends back some directions. That's all I needed. The photos my friend showed me were grainy and old, but the place looked good enough. Simple wooden cabin, surrounded by forest, a small lake not far off. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just quiet. I had some books I wanted to catch up on. I figured I'd cook simple meals, drink a little, hike during the day, and sleep early. I was looking forward to being away from screens and people. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going, which now I realize might have been one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I packed light, a backpack with clothes, a couple of canned goods, a bag of rice, some protein bars, a flashlight, a knife, and a few other things like toothpaste and a towel. I didn't bring any guns because I didn't own any. I thought I'd be fine. I wasn't going into bear country or anything. The drive from my apartment took about 9 hours. The last 2 hours were on this narrow dirt road that got more overgrown the deeper I drove into the forest. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had started going down. It looked just like in the photos, maybe a little more worn down. The wooden planks were darker than I expected, and there was moss growing along the foundation. The windows were small and covered in dust. There was a small stone chimney, though I didn't plan to use the fireplace. I wasn't sure how to. The front door creaked when I opened it, and the smell hit me right away. Old wood, dust, and something else underneath that I couldn't place. Not a strong smell, but just enough to be noticeable. Inside, the place was simple. One room, basically. A small kitchen area with an old sink that I wasn't sure still worked. A table with one chair. A small cot in the corner with a thin mattress. No bathroom, just an outhouse a few steps behind the cabin, which I found later. I didn't mind. I wasn't expecting comfort. I dropped my backpack on the table and looked around a little more. There were a few odd things, though. Small things that I didn't think too much about at first. Like the fact that the mattress already had a blanket folded on it. Or that there was a toothbrush in a cup by the sink. I assumed maybe the owner or caretaker had stayed there recently. It didn't really bother me. The place was isolated. If someone had spent a night here last week or even just a day ago, that didn't mean they were still around. I wiped down the table and laid out my stuff. Ate a protein bar for dinner. Then I sat outside for a while, just watching the trees as the last light disappeared. It was quiet. I could hear birds in the distance, and something that sounded like a raccoon rustling through leaves. It was peaceful. I felt like I could finally breathe. I went to sleep early that night. I wasn't used to sleeping in complete silence, but the exhaustion helped. I didn't even bother locking the door. There was no one around for miles, or at least that's what I thought. The first weird thing happened the next morning. I had gone out to the outhouse just after sunrise. The air was cold and my breath fogged in front of me. When I came back inside, my backpack was zipped up. I had left it open the night before. I was sure of it. I had been digging through it, looking for my toothbrush. Now it was zipped. I stood there for a few seconds, just staring at it. Maybe I had zipped it without realizing. That was possible. I've been tired, but it felt off. I checked inside. Nothing was missing. Everything was where it should be. Later that day, I hiked out toward the lake. It wasn't far. Maybe a 15-minute walk through a clearing and then along a slope. I stayed there for a while, skipping stones and sitting on a log. I was gone for maybe an hour. When I came back, there were 2 fresh boot prints on the wooden floor just inside the front door. I hadn't seen them before. The cabin had a thin layer of dust on the floor, and the prints were clean. Deep. I checked my own boots. They didn't match. Mine had a square tread pattern. The prints were circular, almost like hiking boots. I bent down and measured with my hand. They were a little smaller than mine, maybe a size 9. I wear 11s. I walked around the cabin, checked behind it, looked out into the woods. I didn't see anyone. No cars, no bikes, nothing. I told myself it had to be the owner or someone from nearby. Maybe they'd come to check on the place and saw my stuff and left. But why would they come in while I was gone? And why wouldn't they leave a note or knock first? I couldn't stop thinking about it, but I stayed. I didn't want to overreact. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. That night, I locked the door. The next day, I woke up and found a piece of cooked meat in the sink, just sitting there, a strip of something dark and greasy. It looked like beef, but it was cold and stiff. I hadn't cooked anything. I hadn't even lit the stove. I picked it up with a fork and dropped it outside. Then I went around and made sure every window was closed. I nailed a towel over one of them because it didn't have a lock. I kept the knife in my pocket. I even stacked a few pans by the door so I'd hear if someone came in. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid on the cot with the blanket pulled up, staring at the door, listening. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, or a twig snap, or breathing. But it was so hard to tell what was real and what was just my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. At one point, I thought I saw movement outside the window, but when I stood up and looked, there was nothing. The next morning, I found something carved into the wooden table. Just 3 letters, D-O-N. They weren't there before. I would have noticed. The letters were fresh, scratched in with something sharp. I stared at them for a long time. I had no idea what they meant. A name? A warning? I started to feel like I wasn't alone out there. Not in the way I thought. Someone else had been inside the cabin while I was sleeping. That became very clear. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself I'd stay just one more night. I'd leave first thing in the morning. The problem was, when night came, my car keys were gone. I tore through my backpack, the table, the floorboards. I looked everywhere. They weren't there. I knew I had left them in my jacket pocket. I always do, but they were gone. I ran outside, hoping maybe I had dropped them. Nothing. I even crawled under the cabin, thinking maybe they'd been thrown down there. Still nothing. I slept with a knife in my hand that night. I didn't sleep long. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard movement outside, slow footsteps on the grass. I sat up in the dark, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside the window. I couldn't see anything. It was too dark, but I knew someone was there. Then I heard a light tapping. Not on the window, but on the wall. Just soft, steady tapping, like a stick or a finger. It moved from one wall to the next, around the cabin. Then silence. I didn't move until morning. When the sun came up, I went outside with the knife. I looked all around. No one. But on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood, were more letters, T-R-U-S. I still don't know what it meant. Maybe trust, maybe not, but that was it for me. I grabbed my backpack and started walking. I didn't care about the car. I just followed the dirt road the way I came in. I walked for hours. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. Every sound made me turn around. Every bird or squirrel felt like it was watching me. Finally, sometime in the afternoon, a truck came down the road. I ran into the middle and waved. The guy looked confused but let me climb in. I didn't explain much, just said my car broke down. He dropped me off at a gas station an hour later. I called a friend and got a ride back to the city. I never went back for the car. I canceled the registration. The guy who owned the cabin never answered my messages. The friend who gave me the contact said he lost touch too. Weeks later, I saw a news article about a hiker who went missing in the same forest. No signs of struggle, just disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night, if I hadn't locked the door, if I had woken up just a few seconds earlier, or later. I don't stay in remote cabins anymore. I needed to get away. Not in a spiritual or dramatic way, not like I was on the run from something heavy. I just needed peace and quiet for a while. My job involved writing technical manuals and reports for a company that makes industrial machines. Nothing glamorous, just dense, boring stuff. But I was good at it, and I liked the simplicity of it. My boss wanted the latest revision of a 300-page manual in 2 weeks, and I couldn't think clearly in my apartment with all the noise from neighbors and street traffic. So I figured I'd go somewhere quiet for a few days, maybe even a week, and just knock the whole thing out. A friend of mine had told me about a small cabin he'd stayed at once, way out in the woods of northern Michigan. It was part of an old hunting property that a guy rented out when it wasn't deer season. No internet, no neighbors, just a dirt road leading in and out. Solar power and a backup generator, but no cell service. At first that felt risky, but the more I thought about it, the better it sounded. No notifications, no distractions. I booked it for 8 days and drove up on a Tuesday morning in April. The snow had just melted, and the spring mud season hadn't quite begun yet. The drive took almost 10 hours. The last hour was on a twisting gravel road through forest that looked untouched, like it hadn't changed since the 1800s. No houses, no stores, just miles of trees and hills. My phone dropped signal about 20 miles from the cabin, which I expected. I wasn't worried. I had a satellite radio in the car, a topographic map the owner emailed me, and a fully charged Garmin GPS unit in my bag. The cabin looked like something out of a survivalist magazine, nothing pretty, just practical. It was a single-story wooden structure with a steel roof and a big propane tank off to the side. The windows had thick wooden shutters on hinges, most of them already open. It sat on a slight slope with tall pines and birch trees all around, and about 200 feet behind it was a shallow creek running through a muddy gully. Inside was just one main room with a bed, table, a wood stove, a little kitchenette with a propane stove and sink, and a small bathroom that flushed into a holding tank. There was also a generator room attached to the back with a big diesel generator that the owner said to only use if the solar battery dropped too low. There were 2 solar panels mounted on the roof. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and started reviewing my notes that evening. It was cold inside, but the wood stove warmed it up fast once I got a fire going. I turned in early and slept like a rock. The next few days were exactly what I needed. I followed the same routine every day. Wake up at sunrise, make oatmeal and coffee, sit at the table and write all day, go for a short walk before dark, eat dinner, then go to sleep. No social media, no emails, no news, just silence and work. But on the 5th day, something started to feel off. It began with little things I couldn't explain right away. On Friday morning, I woke up and found the door to the generator shed slightly open. I was sure I'd closed it. There was no wind strong enough to open that thick door on its own. I figured maybe I hadn't latched it right. The wind does strange things in forests. I went over, latched it properly, and didn't think much of it. Later that same day, when I went for my usual walk along the creek, I noticed a single boot print in the soft dirt on the bank. It wasn't mine. Mine were hiking boots with a square lug pattern. This one was longer and thinner with a smoother sole like a work boot or something similar. I stared at it for a long time. It was angled toward the water, as if someone had been standing there. It looked fresh. I looked around in all directions, but I didn't see or hear anyone. The trees were quiet. I walked the whole loop I usually did, maybe 2 miles total, and didn't see another footprint. Just that one. I tried to tell myself it could have been from before I arrived. Maybe the owner came out here recently to check the property. But that didn't make sense. The print was too clean. It hadn't rained, so there was no smudging. The edges were crisp. That night, I locked the door before bed, which I hadn't been doing before. The cabin felt different now. I kept telling myself it was just because I'd been isolated too long, but I started feeling like someone had been nearby. Or worse still was, Saturday morning I found scratches on the cabin door. They weren't deep gouges, more like shallow lines, maybe 4 or 5 of them, about a foot long each. Too long for any small animal. The spacing looked off for a bear or raccoon. They were uneven, erratic. I tried not to panic. I told myself again that it could be from an animal. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't. It didn't look like claw marks. It looked like someone had dragged a knife or some sharp tool lightly across the wood, like testing it. I spent the day inside with the blinds drawn. I left my laptop closed. I didn't do any writing. I sat on the edge of the bed most of the time, looking out through a small gap in the curtain. I didn't see anyone, but I kept thinking I heard faint movement in the woods. I tried to convince myself it was birds or squirrels, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded heavier, slower. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the wood stove low and stayed in my clothes. I left a flashlight and a kitchen knife beside the bed. At one point, I thought I heard a light tap on the window. Just one. Then nothing. I lay there, holding my breath for what felt like an hour. The next morning, I went outside to check. There was a faint smudge on the glass. It was oval, about the size of a fingertip, like someone had pressed it there. The surrounding ground had no tracks, just packed pine needles. But I saw a small indent near the corner of the cabin, like a knee had pressed into the dirt. I made up my mind right then to leave. I started packing. I figured I could be home by midnight if I drove straight through. But when I tried to start the car, it didn't turn over. Battery was fine. Lights came on. But the engine wouldn't crank. Just a dull click. I opened the hood and stared at the engine like I knew what I was doing. Everything looked normal. No wires hanging loose. No chew marks like a squirrel had gotten in. I tried starting it 3 more times. Same result. I stood there in the silence for a long time. The forest around me felt bigger now, like it was pressing in. I looked up at the sky. It was overcast. The wind was colder. I went back inside, locked the door again, and sat at the table. I stared at the cold cup of coffee I'd left there. I still had food and water, enough to last a few more days if I rationed. I had the generator for backup power. I thought about walking to the nearest gas station or house, but the closest one was almost 20 miles away through unmarked woods. No phone service. I'd get lost. And if there really was someone watching me, the last thing I wanted was to be alone in the woods overnight. I waited another day. That night, I barely slept again. I kept waking up to sounds outside, twigs snapping, the crunch of leaves. Once I thought I heard footsteps right by the wall, slow and deliberate. I held the flashlight and knife all night. Monday morning, I went out again to check the car. That's when I saw the rear tire. It was flat. There was a small slash in the sidewall. Clean, deliberate. Not a puncture from a rock. Not wear and tear. It had been cut. That broke me a little. I stood there with my hands shaking, looking at the tire, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. I wasn't imagining this. Someone had been near the cabin. Someone had touched my window. Someone had cut the tire. I went back inside, shut the door, bolted it, and didn't move all day. That evening, I turned on the generator and sat with the lights on for an hour. I needed the noise. I needed something to drown out the silence. At around 10 p.m., the generator died, just cut out completely. I walked out with the flashlight, barefoot, half-crazed, and checked it. The fuel gauge was still halfway full. I opened the panel. The wires inside had been yanked out. I turned around slowly and shone the flashlight toward the trees. Nothing, just the thick black line of forest. I didn't even call out. I knew whoever had done it wasn't far. I ran back inside, slammed the door, locked it, and pushed the table in front of it. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, facing the door, with the knife in my hand. I kept thinking I heard someone trying the handle, just gently as if testing it. Then I heard scratching again, higher this time, like up near the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. When the light finally came in through the curtains, I grabbed my bag, loaded it with essentials, food, water, GPS, knife, and walked. I didn't even try to fix the car again. I left it behind. I locked the cabin behind me, like it mattered. I followed the creek for hours, using the GPS to track south toward the highway. I didn't use trails. I stuck to the brush, moving quiet and slow. I kept checking behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched the whole time. I decided to spend a week in a remote cabin in early October, just before the temperature really dropped for the season. I had been working too much back in the city and needed something quiet, something that didn't involve ringing phones, honking cars, or emails piling up every hour. A friend of a friend had a cabin he didn't use anymore, said I could stay there as long as I brought my own supplies and didn't mess anything up. He didn't charge me anything, just handed over the keys and gave me some rough directions. The place was in northern Idaho, maybe an hour and a half from any real town. He told me to take a dirt road off a 2-lane highway that didn't have a name and follow it until the trees opened up into a clearing. From there, I was supposed to park the truck near the tree stump with an old beer can nailed to it. The cabin would be up the hill, hidden behind thick trees. I followed his directions as best I could. It was already past noon when I arrived at the edge of the forest. The dirt road was narrow and muddy from recent rain. My tires kicked up wet leaves and slid a little on the incline. I passed a rusted-out truck buried in the brush to the right. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Vines were growing through the front grille. The windshield was cracked and fogged with dirt. Something about it made my stomach feel tight, like the kind of nervous feeling you get before a job interview, except this was out here in the middle of nowhere with no reason for it. I kept driving until I saw the beer can nailed to the tree stump. It was faded red, old. Looked like it had been there for years. I pulled off to the side, got out, and slung my backpack over my shoulder. I had packed a week's worth of food, some tools, 2 large bottles of water, a flashlight, a radio, extra batteries, a sleeping bag, and a heavy-duty knife. I didn't think I'd need the knife, but I brought it anyway. Just made me feel safer. I also had a big container of bear spray. You always hear stories about people running into trouble out here, and I wasn't about to be one of them. The hike up to the cabin took about 10 minutes. The air smelled clean. Pine, dirt, damp leaves. Everything was quiet. No wind, no birds, no planes overhead. Just silence. I remember thinking how rare that kind of quiet is. You never hear complete silence back in the city. When I reached the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. Just one room, a porch out front, and a woodpile stacked against the wall. The windows were dusty and the roof sagged a little. The door stuck when I tried to open it, but after leaning my shoulder into it, it gave way. Inside, the place smelled like old wood and dust. There was a cot in one corner, a metal stove, and a small table with a few chairs. I dropped my bag on the floor and opened the windows to let the air in. The walls were bare except for a calendar from 2003, yellowed with age. Some spider webs stretched across the corners, but otherwise, it looked like no one had been there in years. I started to clean up a bit, swept the floor with a broken broom I found behind the door and stacked some fresh wood near the stove for later. That night, I sat out on the porch and watched the sun go down. The sky turned orange and pink above the trees. I didn't see any houses nearby, no power lines, no fences, just trees in every direction. I started to relax. It felt good to be away from everything. I slept surprisingly well, even though the cot creaked every time I moved. The next morning, I decided to explore the land a little. My friend's friend told me the place sat on about 20 acres, mostly forest, with a small stream running down the east side. I followed a narrow deer trail through the trees. The ground was soft from recent rain. I found the stream and sat near it for a while, listening to the water. Then I saw something strange. About 100 feet from the stream, there was a tree with something hanging from it. I thought it was a wind chime at first, but when I got closer, I saw it was a line of empty cans. Beer cans, soup cans, tuna cans, all tied together with some kind of string or wire. They swayed gently even though there wasn't any wind. It looked like a kind of warning, like a signal to stay out. I looked around but didn't see any other signs. No fences, no trespassing signs, nothing. I didn't want to push my luck, so I turned around and went back to the cabin. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. Not animals, something heavier, like boots crunching on leaves. I sat up in the dark and held still. I didn't breathe for a few seconds, trying to hear better. The noise stopped. I waited maybe 10 minutes. Nothing. Then I laid back down, but I didn't fall asleep for a long time. In the morning, I looked around the cabin but didn't see anything unusual. No footprints, no disturbed dirt. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear passing through. Still, I started keeping the knife with me even inside. By day 3, I was jumpy. Every noise made me turn my head. I kept checking the tree line every few minutes. I noticed things that weren't there before. Branches broken at odd angles, new boot prints in the mud near the path. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it felt like someone had been near the cabin. I walked back to the stream again, took a different path, and found another line of cans hanging from a tree, almost identical to the first one. This time, it had a dead bird tied into it. Its neck was broken and it looked fresh. Its feathers were still clean, like it had only been dead a few hours. The string wrapped tightly around its neck, holding it in place. It was swinging slightly, slowly turning in the breeze. I stood there staring at it for a long time. When I got back to the cabin, I started locking the door with a rope tied between the handle and a metal hook on the wall. There was no lock built into the door, just an old latch that didn't stay closed. I moved the table and chairs in front of the door at night just in case. I also stopped opening the windows. That night was worse. At around 1 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, definite footsteps, someone walking slowly around the cabin. I could hear them circling, first on the side by the stove, then moving around to the front porch. Then silence, then footsteps again behind the cabin this time. I was lying on the cot with the knife in my hand and the bear spray next to me. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like it shook my chest. Then something scraped across the side of the cabin. Wood on wood, slow, like someone dragging a stick or maybe the edge of a knife across the wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there and waited. The sounds went on for over an hour. Then, finally, everything went quiet. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat in the corner with my back against the wall until the sun came up. When it got light, I went outside to look. There were boot prints in the mud, large ones, much larger than mine. They circled the cabin in a wide loop. I followed them a little ways into the trees but lost them near the stream. There was a cigarette but still smoking near a rock about 50 yards from the cabin. Someone had been watching, maybe all night. I packed up my stuff and decided I'd leave the next morning. I didn't want to hike back down in the dark. I kept the knife on me at all times, even when using the bathroom in the trees. That final night, I kept all the lights off, sat near the door with the stove out and everything cold, just listening. Around 3 a.m., I saw a small light flicker through the trees, like a flashlight. Stayed for a while, then slowly moved away. I never heard any footsteps this time, just the light, then darkness. First light, I left. I didn't even eat breakfast, just packed up my things and made my way down the trail. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. When I got to my truck, I found something stuck in the wiper blade, a folded piece of paper. It said in rough handwriting, "This land isn't yours." That was it. Nothing else. I drove straight back to the highway, didn't stop once. When I got back to town, I told the guy who gave me the keys what had happened. He just shook his head and said the property lines were never really clear out there, and some folks didn't like strangers wandering around. I asked him why he didn't mention that before. He shrugged. I didn't push it. I didn't tell anyone else. I never went back. I drove up into the woods on a Thursday morning in late October. The sky was still gray and dull from a week of light rain, and the roads were slick. I had taken 2 weeks off work after burning out from back-to-back deadlines and meetings that never seemed to end. I didn't tell anyone where I was going except for my brother. I just told him I needed to clear my head. I didn't give him the exact address, just said it was near Lake Winberg and that it was a rental. That was enough. I turned off my phone after reaching the edge of the town nearby and kept it that way the entire trip. The cabin I found was small, not much more than a box with a sloped roof. It sat maybe 30 or 40 feet from the shore of the lake, with a broken wooden dock stretching into the water. There was no cell signal and no other cabins or buildings in sight. The nearest neighbor was a mile and a half down the lake's south end. That was how I wanted it. The place looked worn and old, but the inside was clean enough. It had one main room with a bed, small kitchen, table, and a wood stove. A smaller room held a toilet and a cold shower. The tap water came from a tank out back that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I brought my own water just in case. The power came from a small gas generator on the side of the house. I was told to turn it off at night to save fuel. That first day was calm. I unpacked my food, turned the generator on for a few hours, and sat outside with a jacket and a notebook. The wind coming off the lake made it colder than I expected, so I started a fire in the stove before it got dark. I read a little, then went to bed early. There was no cell service, no internet, no TV. Just trees, water, and silence. I fell asleep fast, with the stove giving off just enough heat to keep the cabin from freezing. The next day, I hiked along the lake's edge, following an old trail that ran north and circled back after about 5 miles. There were no people, no animals, just the sound of water hitting the rocks and the occasional bird overhead. I saw some footprints on the trail but figured they were from a hunter or fisherman. This was common land and I didn't think much of it. That night, I stayed up later. I had brought a few books and a small camping lantern that ran on batteries. I read until about 10, then shut everything off. The cabin got cold fast without the stove, but I had thick blankets and wore a sweater to sleep. I woke up around 3 in the morning, not from a sound, but just from the cold. I lay there for a bit, staring at the black ceiling, thinking I should get up and light the stove again. But I didn't. I just pulled the blanket tighter and fell back asleep. It wasn't until the next day, the third day, that I noticed something strange. When I went out to get firewood from the small pile out back, I saw that the pieces had been moved. Not taken, just moved. The neat stack I had made was now crooked. Some pieces had fallen. A few had fresh chips in them like they'd been knocked around. I thought maybe an animal did it. A raccoon maybe, or the wind. I fixed the stack and brought some inside. Later that afternoon, I went for another walk, this time down the path that ran southwest toward the dense woods. I walked for about an hour before turning back. The sun was already dropping low, and I didn't want to be caught out after dark. When I came back to the cabin, I saw a fresh boot print in the soft ground near the porch. My own boots left a flatter, wider print. This one was narrower, with a deeper heel and pointed toe. Someone else had been there while I was gone. I looked around for other prints, but didn't find any. I listened. Nothing. I felt a little uneasy, but told myself it could have been left by the owner or someone passing through. The land wasn't private. It still made me nervous, so I decided to keep the hatchet I brought inside the cabin from then on. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept thinking about that print. Every little creak in the walls made me freeze up. The stove popped a few times as the wood burned unevenly. That used to be a calming sound. Now it made me sit up and stare into the darkness. I ended up dozing off and waking again around 4. This time I thought I heard something outside. A soft thump. Not close, but not far either. I stayed in bed and held my breath, listening. The sound didn't come again. After a few minutes, I told myself it was probably a branch falling. I eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I went outside and walked a slow circle around the cabin. I looked for any new signs, prints, broken branches, anything. I didn't see anything until I got to the dock. There, at the end of the old wooden planks, was a folding chair. A simple camping chair, one that hadn't been there before. It was facing the cabin. Someone had placed it there recently. The seat was dry, but the legs had fresh dirt stuck to them. I didn't own that chair. I didn't bring it. It wasn't there the day before. I didn't go near it. I just stared at it from the start of the dock. I looked out at the water, then back toward the trees behind the cabin. Nothing moved. No birds, no wind. Nothing. I walked back inside and locked the door. I sat at the table and didn't do anything for over an hour. Just sat there thinking. Someone had come while I was asleep or gone and left that chair. That meant they weren't afraid to get close. They wanted me to see it. Maybe they had been watching the cabin from there, sitting quietly at night, facing the window. I kept the curtains closed after that. That day, I didn't go for a walk. I didn't leave the cabin except to bring in more firewood. I didn't want to run the generator, but I had to charge my flashlight. I kept it on low and stayed inside all day, watching through the small window. I didn't see anything. No one came, but I never felt alone. Not once. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed dressed, boots on, hatchet by the bed. I kept the flashlight next to me. I left the stove off so it wouldn't make any noise. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Every now and then I sat up and looked through the gap in the curtain. Still nothing. At some point, just after midnight, I heard something again. This time it was clearer. It was the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. Slow, steady, heavy. Then they stopped, right outside the front door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just gripped the hatchet and stared at the door. There was no knock, no sound of the handle moving, just silence. Then I heard it again. This time, the footsteps moved away. Slow again. Back toward the lake. Back toward the dock. I waited for a long time, probably over an hour before I got up. I crept to the window and looked out through the side of the curtain. I couldn't see anything. The moon was behind clouds and everything looked flat and gray. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the porch. More boot prints, the same kind as before. Narrow, deep heel. Not mine. They went from the trees to the door, then back toward the lake. I followed them. They led me back to the chair. It was still there, facing the cabin. But now there was something on the seat. Polaroid photo. I picked it up. It was a picture of the cabin, taken from the woods, from a distance. At night, the windows glowed in the photo, lit by the lantern I used. It had to be taken the night before, maybe even 2 nights ago. Someone had been out there, watching me, taking pictures, leaving chairs, standing on my porch in the middle of the night. That was enough. I went back inside, packed my bag, and turned the generator on one last time. I charged my phone for 10 minutes. I didn't wait for a signal. I just drove. I drove back down the dirt road, hit the highway, and didn't stop until I reached town. I found the first gas station with a signal and called my brother. I told him everything. We went back the next day. I didn't want to, but he made me report it. The police met us at the cabin. We found more photos inside, tucked under the mattress. Someone had entered while I was gone or sleeping. All of them were of me. Some were taken through the window, some from the trees. One showed me sitting at the table. Another showed me reading. The creepiest one was of me sleeping. It had to have been taken from inside the cabin. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints. Nothing was stolen, just those photos, that chair, those prints. The police filed a report, said they'd keep an eye out, but nothing ever came of it. The cabin was owned by some company that rented to hunters and loners like me. There were no cameras, no logs of who else had stayed nearby. I never went back. Even now, months later, I still don't sleep well. Every sound makes me sit up in bed. Every photo I see reminds me of that night. Every creak in the walls makes me grip the handle of a kitchen knife. And the worst part is this: I don't think they wanted to hurt me. I think they just liked watching. And I think they're still doing it. Somewhere. I didn't grow up in the country, and I never really got used to silence. I was used to traffic, to apartment doors slamming down the hall, to the muffled voices from TVs behind my bedroom wall. I didn't like nature much either. Bugs, wild animals, the cold. But after my 3rd panic attack in 2 months, my doctor told me to take a break. Said I needed a change of pace, some time away from people, screens, and the stress of city life. I didn't argue. I was tired all the time, burned out, grinding teeth in my sleep, drinking too much coffee, and forgetting things I had just done. So when a friend told me about a cheap little cabin they once stayed at near an abandoned rock quarry, I booked it for 2 weeks without thinking much. The place was in the middle of nowhere. I don't even remember the name of the nearest town. Just a gas station, a bait shop, and a closed diner with faded letters still hanging over the door. I drove 4 hours out there in my beat-up car, half excited, half nervous. The last stretch was just a gravel road, no streetlights, trees pressing in from both sides. My phone had 1 bar, and even that disappeared by the time I reached the turnoff. The cabin wasn't fancy. Just one room with a small kitchen, a bathroom with a shower that barely trickled, and a mattress on a low bed frame. It smelled like old wood and dust. There was a metal stove in the corner and a small stack of chopped firewood. The place had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any reception. I sat on the bed, took a deep breath, and tried to tell myself this was what I needed. For the first 2 days, I did nothing. Read a paperback I found on the shelf, walked around the edge of the forest, cooked instant noodles on the stove. I kept expecting to feel bored, but I didn't. I actually felt okay. Not good, not relaxed exactly, but quieter, slower. The quarry was only about a 15-minute walk down the dirt path behind the cabin. I didn't go near it at first, just glanced toward it from the trees. The cliffs dropped off sharply, and the water looked black and still. On the third day, I hiked a bit further and sat on a rock near the edge. The air smelled like wet stone and pine. I tossed a pebble into the water and watched the ripples disappear. It was quiet, not peaceful quiet, not the kind where you feel safe. It was a kind of quiet that made your ears feel too open, like you were waiting for something to happen. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I heard something outside, maybe an animal moving through the brush. I told myself it was normal. There were raccoons, maybe deer. I rolled over and buried my head in the pillow. The cabin didn't have curtains, just bare windows with black nothing behind them. I didn't like that. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing looked touched. No paw prints or trash scattered. Still, something felt off. I made coffee and tried not to think about it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone in the woods. Of course, things would sound different. By the 5th day, I started noticing little things. The firewood looked moved. Not taken, not added, just shifted. I had made a neat little stack inside, and now it wasn't neat. A piece lay a few feet from the rest. I didn't remember doing that. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was tired when I brought it in. Maybe it rolled. But I started making mental notes of where I left things. I kept a lighter on the kitchen counter. That night, it was in the sink. A spoon I had left in the drying rack was back in the drawer. I told myself I must have done it without thinking. Maybe I was forgetting things again, like before, but it kept happening. The book I was reading was closed one morning when I left it open the night before. My backpack was zipped up when I remembered leaving it half open. That night, I heard footsteps. Not animal sounds, actual footsteps, slow, careful ones. Crunching gravel and snapping twigs, just outside the window. I stayed still. I didn't move, didn't breathe loud. I kept thinking it was someone passing through. Maybe a hunter. But who walks around at 1 in the morning? I waited for what felt like forever. The sounds stopped. I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to look out the window. I didn't want to see anything there. I stayed in bed, curled tight, trying not to make a sound. At some point, I fell asleep. In the morning, everything looked the same. But I noticed one of my boots was moved. Just slightly. It had been against the wall, and now it was crooked. There was a small smear of mud on the toe. I hadn't gone anywhere since the quarry 2 days before. That day, I stayed inside. I didn't hike, didn't go to the quarry. I just sat with the stove going and listened. Every creak, every thump of wind made me jump. I told myself it was fine. Maybe someone was camping nearby. Maybe they just passed through. I still had a few days left. I didn't want to leave early and feel like I had failed at relaxing. But that night was worse. I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, breathing. Right outside the wall. I was lying in bed, holding still, and I heard it. Slow, wet breathing. Not deep. Shallow, like someone trying to be quiet. I didn't move. My heart felt like it was pounding into my throat. I stared at the ceiling, counting seconds. After a while, it stopped. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. It was soft, like someone testing it. Not yanking, not knocking, just turning it slowly, back and forth. I couldn't move. I couldn't even reach for anything. I didn't own a gun, and I didn't think to bring any kind of protection. I just laid there, completely still. After a few minutes, it stopped. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I got up and checked the door. It was locked. No marks, no scratches, nothing obvious. I walked around the outside of the cabin. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't boot prints, just socks. Someone had walked around the cabin in just socks. The ground was damp from morning dew, and the prints were fresh. They went around the side, past the window, and back into the woods. I followed them a little, but they disappeared into the brush. I packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't want to be there that night. I threw food, a flashlight, and a blanket into it. I didn't feel safe in the cabin anymore. I locked the door and walked down to the quarry. I figured I could sit by the water and calm down. Maybe wait until the sun started going down, then go sleep in the car. The quarry was still. No wind, no birds. I sat on the rock again, same one as before, and watched the water. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. Across the water, on the far side of the quarry, there was a narrow path through the brush. It was almost hidden, but I could just make it out. I hadn't seen it before. It didn't look like a game trail. It looked used. I stood and followed the edge of the quarry, circling to the other side. The path went into the trees, and after maybe 50 feet, I found it. A small lean-to built into the side of a boulder. Old tarp, wooden slats, some crates stacked like a bench. Empty food wrappers, plastic bottles, and a pile of clothes. And socks. Dozens of socks, all dirty, balled up in a pile. There were also ropes, several coiled neatly in a milk crate, and a hunting knife stuck into a log. There was a Polaroid camera too, sitting on the crate. I felt sick. My skin felt tight. I backed out of there slowly, careful not to step on anything. I walked back to the cabin fast. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise. When I got inside, I locked the door and pulled the small dresser in front of it. I stayed in the corner with my bag and didn't move. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with the flashlight in my lap and my ears open. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the window. They came up to the door. And then, something touched the handle again. Slow, like before. Then silence. I didn't make a sound. First light, I left. I didn't wait. I left the food, the extra clothes, everything. I took the bag and got into the car and drove. Didn't even check the back seat. I just drove until I hit a gas station with people. I didn't go to the police. I didn't know what to say. There wasn't a crime. No proof. Just socks. Just rope. Just breathing in the dark. I never went back. I never told my friend what I saw. I didn't want to explain it. I just know I wasn't alone out there. Someone lived near that quarry. Someone watched the cabin at night. Someone tried the door. And someone walked barefoot in the woods with a camera and a knife and a crate full of rope. It started as a simple plan to disconnect for a while. I had been working nonstop for months, dealing with city noise, traffic, emails that never stopped, and meetings that dragged longer than they should. I needed a break, something quiet and far away from people. I didn't want to check my phone every few minutes or hear horns outside my window, so I rented a cabin way out in the woods through a small listing site I found by accident. The cabin was about 4 hours away from the city, surrounded by thick trees and old dirt roads. No neighbors for miles. No cell signal. Just what I needed. I packed a few clothes, some food, a small cooler, basic tools, books, and a first aid kit. I filled up the gas tank, bought extra water, and even brought a notebook in case I felt like writing or drawing. The plan was to stay for 7 days. No internet, no news, no calls. Just quiet. The drive was fine for the first 2 hours. After that, the paved road turned into a gravel path that snaked through dense forest. Trees pressed in on both sides. The GPS stopped working after a while, but I had already written down the directions. I followed the landmarks. A fallen tree that looked like a giant arch, an old rusted fence, a dried-up creek. Eventually, I found the small wooden sign nailed to a post that simply read cabin. The cabin sat alone in a clearing. It wasn't big, just a single room with a bed, a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen space with an old gas stove. There was a shed in the back, locked with a chain. No plumbing, no electricity. A hand pump well stood about 20 feet from the porch. There was an outhouse a little further into the trees. It all looked weathered but solid. I liked it. I unpacked slowly. The air smelled like pine needles and dirt. The quiet was deep. No cars, no talking. Just wind through trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the light change as the sun moved behind the trees. Felt peaceful. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. I read, made simple meals, walked the trails around the cabin, and wrote in my notebook. I slept early and woke with the light. I heard animals at night sometimes, probably raccoons or maybe deer. Once I heard a fox screaming, and it sent a chill down my spine. But I reminded myself that nature was loud sometimes. By the third day, I started noticing little things. Not strange exactly, but off. There was a dark stain on the floor near the fireplace. It looked like old water damage at first, but the wood around it wasn't warped. I didn't think much of it. Just added character, I thought. That night, I sat by the fire reading when I noticed something odd about the floorboards. One of them was slightly higher than the rest, almost like it had been pried up and placed back down without care. I ran my fingers along the edge. There was a tiny gap where the board didn't meet the next one cleanly. I got my multi-tool from my bag and used the flat part to wedge into the gap. Creaked a little, then lifted with a bit of effort. It wasn't nailed down, just sitting in place. Underneath, I expected to see dirt or maybe a small hole for storage. But what I saw was wrapped cloth. Dirty, stiff, and stained in spots. I pulled it out. It was heavy. The cloth looked like old canvas, maybe a curtain or sack. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a long, thick object wrapped in plastic. I peeled that back, and my stomach turned. It was a hunting knife, but not just any knife. The blade was rusty, but the shape was clear, long, sharp, serrated at the back. There was dried brown along the handle and edge. It looked like it hadn't been cleaned properly. My hands shook a little. I wrapped it back up and set it aside. Under where the knife had been was something else. A stained piece of cloth, maybe a shirt. There were brown smears on it, too. I felt sick. I stood up and stepped back. My breathing got fast. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't expecting anything like that. I told myself it was probably nothing. A forgotten tool. An old piece of trash. But it didn't feel that way. The way it had been hidden. The dried stains. The knife. It all felt wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept looking at the floor, at the dark spot near the fireplace. I thought about the knife, about the stains. I tried to listen to the night sounds, but every creak felt louder. Every snap outside sounded closer. I kept thinking about that gap in the floor. Someone had put that knife there. Someone who didn't want it found. The next morning, I almost packed up and left. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I didn't want to overreact. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. I was in a cabin in the woods. Of course it would be weird and old. I decided to check under more boards. I spent most of that morning pulling up others around the dark spot. Most were nailed tight, but a few lifted easily. Under one, I found more cloth. This time it looked like pants, torn and stiff. Under another, an old boot with dried mud on it. Inside the boot was something hard. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a tooth. I dropped it and stumbled back. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my neck. I stood there staring at the boot for a long time, trying to calm down. I didn't want to believe it, but it was real. I didn't touch anything else that day. I sat outside, staring into the woods. I kept expecting someone to come out of the trees, but no one did. The air felt heavier. The quiet now felt wrong, like something was watching. That night, I heard footsteps outside. Not animals. Slow, careful steps. I sat still on the bed, barely breathing. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet and the rusty knife, which I hadn't cleaned. The steps stopped near the front of the cabin. Then nothing. I stayed awake until the sky turned gray. I wanted to leave, but my car wouldn't start. I turned the key, and it clicked but didn't turn over. I tried again and again. Nothing. I opened the hood but didn't see anything obvious. I'm not great with engines, but the battery was fine. It just wouldn't start. I felt trapped. I started thinking someone had done something to the car. I walked the edge of the clearing, looking for tracks. I found one, a shoe print. Not mine, not from boots. A flat sole like from sneakers, pressed into the soft dirt near the back shed. I hadn't opened the shed yet. I figured it was locked for a reason. But now I was curious, no scared. I used a rock to smash the lock. The shed smelled like old wood and oil. Inside was a workbench, some tools, and old crates. One crate had rope and duct tape. Another had a plastic tarp folded neatly. The last one had a small box inside. I opened it. It held pictures, Polaroids, all of the same person, a man with a beard, maybe in his 30s, in the cabin, on the porch, in the woods. One photo showed him standing over something that looked like a hole. In the corner of that picture, barely visible, was what looked like the same knife I had found. I dropped the box. My stomach turned again. I stepped out of the shed and shut the door. I felt cold even though it was warm outside. I didn't want to stay another night. I decided to hike out. I packed light, just food, water, and my phone, even though it had no signal. I wrote a quick note and left it in the cabin explaining where I went. I headed down the gravel path. It was early afternoon. If I walked fast, I could reach the main road before dark. But a mile in, I noticed someone had been messing with the trail. A fallen tree blocked the path, not like from nature, this one had been dragged. I had to climb over it. Further ahead, I saw cuts in the dirt, like someone had dug shallow holes and covered them. I avoided them. I heard something following me, sticks breaking, rustling. I kept moving. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I reached the road by nightfall. A truck passed after an hour of waiting. I flagged it down. I didn't tell the driver much, just said my car broke down at a cabin. He dropped me at a gas station. I called the police from there. They went to the cabin. They found the knife, the cloth, the photos. They dug under the floor. There were bones, human bones, not fresh. At least 2 people, maybe more. They haven't identified them all yet. They think the cabin had been used by someone years ago to hide bodies. Maybe a hunter, maybe a drifter. No one knew. The owner of the listing site said he bought the land cheap, never checked the cabin, just listed it as is. I don't think they ever found the person who left the knife there, or the one who followed me. Maybe it was the same person, maybe not. They searched the woods but found no one. I haven't gone back. I don't want to. I still dream about it. The dark stain, the knife, the sound of steps outside the cabin at night. I went looking for quiet. I found something buried instead. It started when I booked the cabin for 3 weeks. I had been behind on a freelance editing project and needed a break from the distractions of the city. My sleep schedule was all over the place, and I couldn't go more than 20 minutes without checking my phone or emails. I thought if I could disconnect completely, no Wi-Fi, no calls, no interruptions, I'd get more done in a few days in the woods than I had in months at home. I found the cabin through a small private listing online. It wasn't on Airbnb, just an older site, mostly for hunters and people who wanted to get away from it all. The photos were grainy and old. Wood paneling, a small deck with a rusting grill, and a creek out back. The guy who owned it said there was no reception, no plumbing, no electricity except for a small solar panel to charge a phone in an emergency. There was a wood stove for heat and a propane-powered camping stove for cooking. I paid in advance for the full 3 weeks. The guy gave me a list of instructions and directions in a long email. Things like how to prime the water pump, where to find the emergency radio, what to do if bears showed up, and how to latch the windows when the wind got bad. I drove up from the city the next morning. Took me over 6 hours, most of it on 2-lane highways that eventually gave way to dirt roads. The final stretch was rough. My car, a low little Honda Civic, struggled on the rocky terrain. I had to crawl along at 5 miles per hour, dodging tree branches and potholes big enough to throw the alignment off. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dropping behind the trees, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard. I parked under a tree with yellow leaves and sat in the car for a minute, staring at the place. It looked just like the pictures but older, smaller, The logs looked dry and splintered. The deck sagged slightly in the middle. The front window had a long crack across the top corner. I unlocked the door, hauled in my bags, and stood in the center of the single-room cabin. The floor creaked under my boots. It smelled like old wood, mouse droppings, and dust. There was a bed in one corner, a small table near the window, and a bookshelf lined with soggy paperbacks. The wood stove stood in the far corner near a pile of chopped logs stacked against the wall. There were no curtains on the windows. I spent that first evening unpacking and getting settled. I lit a few candles, opened some cans of soup, and read over the cabin owner's instructions again. I made sure the doors and windows were secure, tested the solar power station by charging my phone a bit, and then shut it off to save juice. I didn't plan on using it unless absolutely necessary. When it got dark fast. There were no street lights, no nearby cabins, no signs of anything human, just trees. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It felt like the woods pressed up against the walls and roof of the cabin, breathing slowly in the darkness just outside. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up every hour, thinking I'd heard something. A branch cracking, a footstep, or maybe just the wind moving around the structure. At some point, I got up and put my boots on and stood by the door for a while. I didn't see anything, just pitch black trees and the faint orange glow of the coals in the wood stove. By the second day, I'd started to settle into a routine. I'd wake up around sunrise, make coffee using bottled water and the propane burner, eat a quick breakfast, and then sit down to work. I didn't bring any distractions. No books, no games, no movies. I told myself it was time to focus, no matter what. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping better. I felt calmer. My thoughts were more focused. I had written more pages in 5 days than I had in 3 months. My back hurt from the stiff mattress, and the place was freezing when I woke up. But I felt good, clean, like I'd gotten out from under something heavy. Then I saw the guy. It was a little after 3 in the afternoon. I was sitting at the table by the window, reading over some notes I'd written by hand. I looked up for no reason and caught movement between the trees out back, past the creek. Person, maybe 100 yards away, just walking slowly through the woods in a dark jacket, dark pants, and a hat. It was so sudden that I froze. He wasn't heading toward the cabin. He wasn't doing anything strange, just moving from right to left through the trees like he was walking a trail. But there were no trails out there. I would have seen them on the satellite view when I downloaded the area offline. And I hadn't seen a single car or hiker since I got there. No signs of anyone. That was the whole point. I watched until he disappeared behind a row of pines and didn't come out the other side. I stood there, hand on the window latch, for what felt like 20 minutes. I didn't open it. I didn't go outside. I just stood and stared at where I'd seen him, wondering if I'd imagined it. Eventually, I made myself sit back down. I told myself it could have been a hunter, or some hiker who had wandered in from another trail system. Maybe someone checking traps or scouting for deer. But from that moment on, something shifted. The woods felt different. At night, I started hearing things. Not constant noises, just little ones. One night, it sounded like something brushing against the back wall. Another night, I swore I heard something thump lightly on the roof, like a branch dropping from above. I'd get up and look, sometimes even step out onto the deck, but I never saw anything. Still, I started keeping my boots near the bed. I started sleeping in my clothes. 3 days after I saw the man, I found footprints near the back of the cabin. I'd gone out that morning to check the water pump and spotted them in the mud along the side of the building. Large boot prints, deep, spaced far apart like whoever made them had a long stride. I crouched down and stared at them for a long time. They weren't mine. I'd only used the front door and the trail to the creek. I'd only worn one pair of boots, and I walked with shorter steps. I compared them to mine by stepping next to one. No match. The prints led from the tree line to the side of the cabin, stopped near the back corner, and then disappeared. No return trail. No signs of where the person went next. That day, I didn't do any work. I spent most of the afternoon walking slow loops around the cabin, checking for more signs. I didn't find anything else, But that night I dragged the heavy table in front of the door. It wouldn't stop someone if they really wanted to get in, but it made me feel better. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found something hanging from a nail on the front of the cabin. Piece of torn cloth, green and brown plaid, like part of a flannel shirt. It hadn't been there the day before. It was pinned between a thin piece of sharpened wood and the wall, like someone had jabbed it there on purpose. That was when I started planning to leave. I told myself I could stick it out, that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I packed a bag and loaded it in the car so I could leave fast if I needed to. I didn't tell anyone back home what was going on because I didn't want to seem dramatic, but I kept my phone charged. I checked the emergency radio every night, just in case. I started sleeping during the day and staying up at night, listening, watching the windows. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the woods. One night I swore I saw a reflection, like light off glass, like binoculars, but it was always far away and brief, never close. Then, 2 days before I was planning to leave, the car was gone. I woke up early, around 5 a.m., just as the sky was starting to lighten. I went outside to stretch my legs and make coffee on the porch, and the space under the tree where I parked was empty. No broken glass, no tire marks, no keys missing from inside, no notes, nothing, just gone. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like the world had folded in on itself. I checked the entire property, walked the perimeter, climbed the ridge near the creek for a better view. Nothing. The road was empty in both directions. It was almost 5 miles to the nearest gravel crossroad. I wasn't even sure which direction would take me to a town. For the rest of that day, I sat in the cabin with the door locked and the table pushed against it. I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook anything. I didn't want the smoke to give away that I was still inside. That night, I heard footsteps, slow, steady steps around the perimeter of the cabin. Gravel crunching, dry leaves moving, then nothing for a while, then a knock, a soft knock on the window above the table. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It didn't happen again. Whoever it was didn't try to get in. They didn't say anything, just knocked once and left. The next morning, the table was gone from the porch. The 2 chairs were stacked neatly on top of each other facing the woods. I didn't sleep the next night. I held a hatchet I'd found under the sink. I stared at the door until my eyes hurt. I didn't move until the light came back. That final morning, I packed what I could carry in my backpack and left on foot. I didn't care about the contract. I didn't care about finishing my project. I didn't care if I made it home or not. I just wanted to leave. I followed the road for hours. No cars passed. No signs of help. The silence was louder than ever. At one point, I saw something in the It started when I needed a break from everything. The job, the city noise, my phone constantly buzzing, even the people. I didn't hate anyone. I was just tired. My head felt full all the time. So I decided to rent a small cabin in a remote forest area for a week. It wasn't anything fancy, just a wooden structure on the edge of a national forest, 2 hours away from the nearest town. It had a bed, a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a bathroom with no running hot water. I brought in supplies, canned food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, some books, and a battery-powered radio. The cabin sat on a slight hill and was surrounded by tall pine trees. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, according to the owner. That was exactly what I wanted, pure quiet. I arrived late in the afternoon, unpacked my stuff, and by the time the sun began to set, I had a small fire going in the stove. Felt peaceful. I remember sitting on the front steps, watching the trees sway in the wind, breathing in the clean forest air. The first night passed without anything unusual. I heard some animals outside, mostly small things, maybe raccoons. I had expected that. But on the second night, I noticed something odd. Right around midnight, I woke up for no real reason. Just opened my eyes. At first, I thought it was because the stove had gone out and the cold had crept in. But the fire was still glowing faintly, and the cabin was warm. It was completely silent. No wind, no creaking wood, not even the sound of insects. That silence was the first thing that made me feel a little uneasy. It didn't make sense. Forests are never completely quiet. I sat up in bed and listened. I couldn't hear anything, and that in itself felt strange. I got out of the bed slowly and looked through the window. The moonlight was enough to light up the clearing around the cabin, and I could see down the slope into the trees. Nothing moved. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out what woke me. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I went back to bed, told myself I was just being paranoid, and tried to sleep, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I went on a short hike through the woods. I brought my backpack, some food, and a map of the area that the owner had left. I followed one of the marked trails for a couple of hours, taking pictures and just walking slowly. The air was crisp and cool, and I felt more relaxed. On the way back, I noticed something. Near the trail, about 20 feet off to the side, there was a small pile of stones. They were stacked neatly, not just a random pile, but arranged one on top of the other, like a small marker. It wasn't big, maybe a foot tall, but it looked deliberate. I walked over to it, bent down to take a closer look. The stones were clean, no moss or dirt, like they had been placed there recently. I didn't touch them. Back at the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about that stone pile. Who put it there? Why? It wasn't on the trail, and it didn't look like a boundary marker. Just a small stack of stones in the middle of the woods. That night, I kept the lantern on longer than usual. I read until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I didn't want to wake up in silence again, but I did. Around the same time, midnight or so, I woke up. Again, I didn't know why. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I didn't even hear the wind. I got out of bed slowly, walked to the window and looked out. This time, I saw something. At the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, there was a figure standing between the trees. I couldn't see details, just a shape, human-sized, not moving. I stared for a long time, trying to tell if it was a tree stump, a shadow, or a person, but it didn't move at all. I waited for what felt like 15 minutes, then finally grabbed my flashlight. I turned it on, pointed it toward the edge of the clearing. The beam reached the tree line, but nothing was there. The figure was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair by the stove, flashlight in hand, listening. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside, a branch snapping, leaves crunching, but every time I looked through the window, I saw nothing. When the sun finally came up, I felt more exhausted than I had in months. I spent the next day checking the area around the cabin. I didn't find any footprints, but the ground was dry and covered in pine needles. Not great for tracking. Still, I circled the cabin twice, checked the doors and windows, made sure everything was locked. I didn't want to cut the trip short. I told myself it had just been a tree. My mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down I didn't believe that. That evening, I decided to stay inside. I didn't go for a walk or sit on the steps. I kept the door locked and the flashlight next to me. I even turned the stove off early, just in case the light drew someone. I lay in bed in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. A noise, a faint thud, like something hitting the side of the cabin. Not loud, just once. I sat up immediately, heart pounding. Then another thud on the back wall. I grabbed the flashlight and waited. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. A third thud came, then silence. I stayed like that for almost 2 hours. Nothing else happened. At dawn, I stepped outside, walked around the cabin. On the back wall, about shoulder height, I saw 3 fresh marks in the wood. They looked like they were made by a rock or something hard. Small chips in the wooden siding, like someone had thrown something at the wall. That was enough. I started packing. My week wasn't over, but I didn't care. I didn't want to stay another night. I loaded everything into the car, double-checked that I wasn't leaving anything, and locked the cabin. As I was walking back to the car, I looked back one last time. There was another stone pile. This one was right in front of the cabin. Same size, same clean, stacked stones. It hadn't been there the day before. I drove straight to the nearest town. Didn't stop. Didn't look in the mirror. I returned the cabin key to the rental office Dropbox and got a motel room for the night. Couldn't sleep. My mind kept going over the details. The silence, the figure, the stone piles, the marks on the wall. I never found out who or what was out there. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That someone was watching me but never approached? That I saw a shape in the woods? They wouldn't take it seriously. I haven't gone back to the woods since. Every now and then I think about it. I try to tell myself there was a logical explanation. But the truth is, I don't know. I just know that something was out there, and it knew I was alone. It wanted me to know it too. I didn't go up to that cabin for fun. It wasn't some weekend getaway. I wasn't looking for adventure or peace or some picture-perfect sunrise over pine trees. I went up there because I was falling apart. My job was gone. A layoff. 10 years of work just wiped out by some budget meeting I never saw. My girlfriend left 2 weeks after that. Then the drinking came hard. Days blurred together. I stopped answering calls. I couldn't sleep more than 2 hours without waking up soaked in sweat, stomach tight, heart racing. I couldn't stand being around anyone. I couldn't stand silence either. I hated what I saw in the mirror. Then I remembered my uncle had a small hunting cabin somewhere in Idaho. A real remote place. He barely used it anymore. I called him, half drunk and fully desperate, and asked if I could use it. He didn't ask questions, just mailed me a spare key and a note with a hand-drawn map, since GPS didn't work well that deep in the forest. So that's how I ended up driving 12 hours straight, deep into the mountains, a cooler full of canned food in the trunk, and more pain in my chest than I knew what to do with. The road got narrower and worse with each hour. Eventually, it wasn't even a road anymore, just ruts and rocks. No signs, no houses, no cell service, just trees swallowing the sky and the sound of tires crunching over dirt. I stopped once to piss and realized how quiet it was. I mean, real quiet, not like the city where there's always something humming. This was total stillness, broken only by wind and my own breath. I reached the cabin around 6 p.m. A squat little thing, old wood, slanted roof, one window in the front and a chimney that leaned a bit too far to the left. The padlock on the door was stiff, but it opened. Inside was smaller than I expected. Just one room, really. Bed on the left, with stove, small table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some old books and hunting gear. The floor creaked under every step. It smelled like dry pine and dust. I sat down, opened a beer, and stared out the window until it got dark. I didn't turn on the old propane lantern, just sat there, listened to the woods breathe. That first night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about things I couldn't fix. My body twitched every time I closed my eyes. Around 2 a.m., I heard a scratching sound outside, just a few quick scrapes. Probably a raccoon or squirrel, I told myself. I didn't check. I just lay there, blanket pulled up to my chin, heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I found a thin line of dirt against the door, like something had dragged a stick or a claw across it. I didn't like it, but I told myself animals get curious. I made coffee over the stove and sat on the steps outside, looking out over the trees. No sounds of cars, no voices, no internet, just wind, birds, and my own scrambled thoughts. I told myself I'd use this time to get clean, eat better, walk, journal, rest. I even brought a sketchbook, but by the end of day 3, I had barely touched any of it. I just sat inside and stared. Sometimes I chopped wood. Other times I lay on the bed and listened, always listening. The trees made weird sounds when the wind blew hard, not just creaking. Sometimes it sounded like something whispering just beyond hearing. And then came the footsteps. It was day 5, late evening. The sky was going pale orange and I was sitting by the woodpile, sharpening a hatchet that came with the cabin. I heard crunching in the woods, slow, heavy, like someone walking, not an animal. I froze, kept my hand on the hatchet. The footsteps stopped. I waited, not breathing, nothing. I went inside, locked the door, and didn't light the lantern. That night I sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight, the footsteps came again, this time closer, circling the cabin. Not fast, just slow steps like whoever or whatever it was didn't care about being quiet. I lay on the bed with the hatchet beside me, heart racing. The footsteps stopped near the front door. Then came the knock. Not hard, not loud, just one soft knock. I stayed absolutely still. My mouth went dry. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, the knock never came again. When the first light of morning crept in, I unlocked the door and stepped outside, hatchet in hand. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No marks on the door. Just cold air and trees that suddenly felt too tall, too still. I should have left then, but I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting my paranoia ruin everything, that maybe I needed more rest, less beer. I lasted another 2 days. The next evening, I heard movement again. This time, it was behind the cabin. I went to the back window and looked out. Nothing, but I stayed there watching, and that's when I saw it. Not clearly, just the shape of a person, maybe 50 feet into the trees. Not moving, just standing. I stared for what felt like 10 full minutes. The figure never moved, not an inch. Then I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found something strange behind the cabin. A dead squirrel hanging from a tree branch. Its stomach had been slit open and something, maybe a stick, had been shoved inside like some kind of warning or message. It looked deliberate, not like any animal attack I'd ever seen. I threw up right there in the dirt. I packed up, tossed all my stuff into the truck, turned the key. Nothing. Engine didn't even click. Battery was dead. I opened the hood. Didn't see anything wrong, but I noticed the battery cables had been cut. Clean, like someone used a knife. That's when the fear really set in. I wasn't just dealing with animals. Someone was out there. Someone was screwing with me. I grabbed the hunting rifle from the cabin. There was a box of ammo on the shelf. I wasn't trained or anything, but I figured it was better than nothing. I spent the day pacing around the cabin, watching the tree line. No more movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed with the rifle across my lap, listening. At some point, around 3 a.m., the door handle moved. Not rattled, not shaken, just slowly turned. It was locked, but whoever was out there was trying to be quiet about it. I aimed the rifle at the door and held my breath. After a minute, the handle stopped moving. Then the footsteps again, walking away slow and steady. I didn't move until sunrise. In the daylight, I stepped outside with the rifle ready. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I found the symbol. Someone had carved a circle with a line through it into the tree just 10 feet from the cabin. Fresh, bark still curled out from the cut. It wasn't just random. It looked like a sign. That's when I lost it. I screamed out loud. Not words, just a broken sound from my throat. I was done pretending I could handle this. I went inside, pulled the mattress off the bed, broke open the floorboards underneath, found a crawl space barely tall enough to fit in. I stashed the water bottles, some food, the ammo, the rifle, and a flashlight down there. Then I climbed in and waited. That day dragged. Every little sound made me jump. My legs cramped. My neck ached. But I didn't come out. That night, I heard them again. More than one this time. Footsteps. 2 sets. Maybe 3. They circled the cabin. I heard something brush the walls. Then scratching near the windows. No talking. No lights. Just them moving, watching, waiting. At one point, I swear someone stood on the roof. I could hear the wood creak above me. I stayed in that crawl space for 2 more days. No more footsteps after the second night. Just silence. On the 3rd morning, I crawled out. My legs were weak. My throat dry. I stepped outside, blinking in the light. The truck was gone. Not just dead, gone. Tires, frame, all of it. Gone. Like it had never been there. That was it. I grabbed my pack, took the rifle, filled my canteen from the creek out back, and started walking. I didn't know exactly where I was. The map was in the truck. but I remembered the general direction I came from. I walked all day, no sign of roads, just forest. I slept under a tree that night, rifle on my chest. The next morning, I found another symbol carved into a tree, same one as before, circle with a line, like they were tracking me. I kept walking, kept checking behind me. Third day out, I saw smoke in the distance. A ranger station. I staggered in around noon. I must have looked like hell. Dirt, scratches, eyes wide like a trapped animal. They called for help, took my statement, didn't say much when I told them what happened. But I saw the look the ranger gave the other guy, like they'd heard this before. The next day, the sheriff drove out to the area. They found the cabin. I never planned on staying in that cabin for more than a week. I booked it last minute when I felt like the pressure was getting too much in the city. My job, which had started off pretty normal, had turned into back-to-back deadlines, constant phone calls, and endless screens. I was writing technical manuals for a company that made safety equipment, and one of the big clients wanted a full draft completed within 8 days. So I figured if I went somewhere quiet with no distractions, I could get it all done. I could just isolate myself, focus completely, and come back feeling proud and rested. The cabin was deep in the woods, 3 hours away from anything that could be called a town. I found it on a rental site. The photos looked decent, simple, just a bed, a kitchen, a desk, a fireplace, and lots of trees. There was no Wi-Fi, which was fine. I downloaded all my reference files and backups beforehand. The listing said there was electricity, hot water, and a working generator as backup. It even mentioned that there was an emergency contact who lived a couple miles down the road. It seemed like a perfect escape. When I got there, I remember thinking the air felt different, colder even in the middle of the day. I parked my car next to the tree line and carried my stuff inside. Mostly groceries, my laptop, a backup battery, and some extra clothes. I checked every corner of the cabin out of habit, just to know where everything was. The floorboards creaked slightly when I walked, but everything else seemed normal. There was no phone signal. I expected that. I had already told my boss and 2 friends that I'd be completely offline for several days. I made some coffee, sat at the desk, and started typing. The first night passed without much. I stayed up late, maybe until 1 a.m. working. I didn't notice how quiet the place was until I turned everything off. There wasn't even the sound of wind, just still trees and black windows. I couldn't sleep right away because my mind was too active, so I laid in bed with a flashlight nearby, listening to the heater tick and settle. Sometime around 4 a.m., I thought I heard something outside, like a branch breaking or a crunch of leaves. It was faint. I sat up and waited, but nothing followed. I assumed it was just some animal or maybe my imagination from being overworked. I eventually went back to sleep. The second day, I worked more, and the silence helped. I got more done in 1 day than I usually did in 3. Around sunset, I made dinner and stepped outside to stretch my legs. There was a small fire pit a few feet away from the porch, but I didn't bother with it. The woods around me were darker than I expected, even before the sun fully disappeared. The trees were dense, standing close together like rows of walls. No moonlight cut through them. I went back inside and locked the door. The weirdness started the next morning. I woke up around 9 a.m., went outside for air, and noticed something strange. There were boot prints in the dirt going around the cabin. They weren't mine. I wear running shoes, not boots. These were heavier, deep, with a pattern I didn't recognize. I followed them around the side of the cabin and saw that they circled the building, paused by the windows, and then disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a while, just looking. My first thought was that it could have been the property manager or the emergency contact. But then I thought, why wouldn't they knock? Why would someone walk around the windows in the middle of the night? I didn't have cell signal, so I couldn't call anyone. I tried to brush it off, went back inside, and tried to work, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound outside made me stop and listen. I thought about leaving early, but I had already paid for the week, and I still had a lot of work left. I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights off and sat by the window listening. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement. There was someone at the edge of the tree line just standing there. I couldn't make out his face, but the shape was clear. A man. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there, facing the cabin. Then he took a few steps closer, then stopped again. I backed away from the window quietly, moved to the side wall, and waited. I didn't want to open the door or make any noise. I didn't even want him to know I saw him. Eventually, I heard slow footsteps crunching leaves. They moved around the cabin. I locked the door and stood still. Then the sound faded. He was gone. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I checked again. More boot prints. This time, they went right up to the door. I stayed inside all day, too scared to leave. I kept a kitchen knife near me and didn't open the blinds. I heard nothing during the day, but I knew he'd come back at night. And he did. This time, I didn't just hear him. I saw his hand on the window. He pressed it flat against the glass, then slowly dragged it down. I wanted to scream, but I stayed quiet. I didn't know what he wanted or why he kept coming back. He never tried to get in. He never knocked. He just watched. After that night, I made up my mind to leave. I packed everything as the sun came up and got in my car. I drove fast through the narrow trail that led back to the main road. My heart didn't slow down until I saw other cars on the highway. I drove to the closest gas station and parked there, shaking. I used their payphone and called my boss. I told her I couldn't finish the project right now, and I was going home. But something didn't feel finished. When I got back to the city, I looked up the area. The listing for the cabin was gone, completely deleted. I called the rental site and asked if they could give me contact info for the owner, but they said the account had been closed and they couldn't release any info. I searched local news. I didn't find anything, no crimes, no missing persons, nothing. But I kept wondering, what if the man didn't know I was there until I made noise the first night? What if I had never turned on the lights, never cooked anything with a smell, never left footprints? What if he watched the cabin all the time, just waiting for someone to show up? A few days later, I went through the photos I took on my phone during the trip. I didn't remember taking pictures at night, but one of them stood out. It was dark and blurry, taken through the window. I think I had tried to capture something, maybe without realizing. But when I zoomed in, I could see something clearly. A man standing by the fire pit, face not visible, but the shape of his head and shoulders was outlined by the moonlight. He wasn't facing the cabin, he was facing the woods. And in the trees behind him, there was someone else, a second figure, barely visible, lower to the ground, crouched or hiding. Watching him, I deleted the photo. I don't know who the man was. I don't know who the second figure was. And I don't know if the cabin was a trap or if it was just a place where people like that went. Maybe I was just unlucky. I never told anyone the full story until now. I never went back to the woods, never rented another remote cabin. I finished the project weeks later from my apartment, but I still couldn't sleep normally for months. Every sound outside my window made me sit up in bed. Every shadow felt like someone waiting. The scariest part isn't that I saw someone out there. It's that I'll never know what he wanted, and I'll never know how long he had been watching, or if he ever stopped. I didn't plan on staying in that cabin. I was just looking for something quiet and cheap for a few weeks, away from the noise and pressure. Work had worn me down. City life was too loud, and I needed some time where I could just wake up without car horns or emails. So I booked the place on a rental site. It wasn't the most popular listing, but the pictures showed a simple wooden cabin deep in the trees, with nothing but forest around. The price was low, almost too low, but I figured that was just because it was far from everything. The photos showed a small bedroom, a kitchen with the basics, a bathroom with a narrow shower, and a living area with a couch and old TV. There was no internet and barely any cell reception. That was part of what made it perfect. I didn't want to talk to anyone or hear from anyone. I just wanted to sleep, read, and walk in the woods. The drive there took longer than expected. After the last town, the road narrowed to a gravel path, and then it turned into a rough trail of dirt and potholes. My car struggled with it, and I kept thinking I'd taken a wrong turn. But after another hour, I saw it. A small wooden cabin with a tin roof, sitting in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. There was no other house or cabin in sight, just forest in every direction. I parked and sat in the car for a moment, just looking at it. It looked older than in the pictures. The paint was peeling, the porch had a broken step, and some of the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. Still, it had a kind of quiet charm. It was the isolation I wanted. Inside, it was dusty and smelled like old wood. The furniture was basic, maybe secondhand. There was no air conditioning, just some old fans. The bed was small and creaked when I sat on it. The kitchen had what I needed: a mini fridge, a microwave, a gas stove, and some mismatched plates and cups. Everything looked like it had been there for a long time. The first few days passed slowly. I spent my time reading, making simple meals, and walking in the woods around the cabin. I didn't see a single other person. No hikers, no cars, nothing. I liked that at first. I could hear the wind through the trees, the sound of birds, the crack of twigs under my boots. It helped me clear my mind. I kept a flashlight with me because it got dark fast under the trees, even before sunset. At night, it got quiet, too quiet. I'd lay in bed listening to the creaks of the old cabin, the ticking of the wall clock, and sometimes a rustle outside. I figured it was raccoons or deer. The forest was full of animals, and the nearest road was miles away. But after a week, little things started to feel off. I started noticing that the front door would be slightly open in the mornings. Not wide, just a few inches. I kept telling myself maybe I hadn't shut it all the way, or maybe it didn't latch right. But it happened 3 mornings in a row. So I started locking it with the deadbolt before bed and pulling hard to test it. Still, I'd wake up and find it cracked open. There were other things too. A chair in the kitchen would be pulled out from the table, even though I always pushed it in after dinner. The hand towel in the bathroom looked like it had been moved. One time I noticed the toilet seat was up, which I never do. It didn't make sense. I started thinking maybe I was just tired or imagining things. I started double-checking everything before I went to sleep, locking the door, shutting the windows, checking every room. Still, every morning something would be different. The cabin had an attic, but there was no staircase or ladder, just a small square hatch in the ceiling of the hallway between the bedroom and bathroom. I didn't think much of it until I started wondering if someone else was living up there. Sounded crazy, but the idea got stuck in my head. I stood under the hatch and stared at it for a long time. I even got a chair and tried to push it open with a broom handle, but it wouldn't budge. Felt sealed shut. I couldn't hear anything up there either, no movement or creaks. I told myself I was being paranoid. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I noticed a faint click sound. Not loud, but sharp, like something mechanical. It came from the far corner of the room. I sat up slowly and looked around. I didn't see anything, just the nightstand, the lamp, and a small wooden bookshelf. Then I noticed something strange about the bookshelf. It had a decorative pattern cut into the wood at the top, but one of the little holes in the pattern looked darker than the others. I got up, walked over, and crouched down. It wasn't just a hole, it was a small round black lens, like a camera. My chest tightened. I reached behind the bookshelf and felt around. There were wires, thin wires running down into the wall. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking. I unplugged the lamp so I could take the bulb and shine it into the hole. It was definitely a lens, hidden in a carved design that made it almost invisible unless you knew where to look. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the lamp on, listening for any sound. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I kept thinking someone might come through the door or down from the attic. In the morning, I packed my bags. I didn't even shower. I just grabbed everything, tossed it into the car, and slammed the trunk shut. As I was walking back to the cabin to check one last time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt outside the window, boot prints that didn't match mine. They were larger and deeper, like someone had been standing there for a long time. And they were fresh. The ground was dry except for where the prints were pressed in. I got in the car and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove down the trail. I hit potholes and scraped the undercarriage, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. Back in town, I went to a motel and took a long shower. I couldn't stop thinking about the camera. I used my phone to check the rental listing, but it had been removed. The host's profile was gone too. I had taken screenshots of the listing when I first booked it, so I still had the photos. I went to the local police station and showed them what I found. They wrote down everything. An officer took my phone to copy the photos. He said they'd send someone to check it out, but I could tell by his face that he didn't think they'd find anything. That was 3 months ago. I haven't heard anything since. I changed my phone number and email. I moved to a different apartment. I don't go anywhere without checking for cameras now. I even unscrew the smoke detector when I stay in a hotel. I don't trust locks anymore. I don't trust silence. Whoever set up that camera had been watching me sleep. Maybe longer. Maybe from inside the cabin. Maybe from the attic. I needed to get away. Not from anything big, no divorce, no trauma, no midlife crisis. I just needed quiet. The city had been chewing me up little by little for years, and I didn't even notice how much until I started getting these constant headaches. Noise, traffic, lights that never turned off, people talking all the time, neighbors arguing through the thin walls, sirens blaring at 2 a.m., and a job that made me sit in front of a screen 10 hours a day. One morning I woke up, stared at the ceiling, and realized that I hadn't heard silence in over a year. That same day, during my lunch break, I booked a remote cabin online. Nothing fancy, just a simple one-bedroom place in the middle of a forest in Idaho. I looked at a few listings and picked the one that had no reviews. I don't know why. Something about it seemed untouched, private. It was tucked away behind miles of dirt roads, had a small lake behind it, no internet, and barely any cell reception. That sounded like heaven. I took a week off from work, packed light, and started the 12-hour drive the following Saturday. The drive itself was peaceful. The deeper I got into the trees, the lighter I felt. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and the air smelled cleaner than anything I'd breathed in years. By the time I pulled into the clearing and saw the little cabin standing there alone, I was already smiling without realizing it. It was late afternoon. The cabin had a wide wooden porch, 2 rocking chairs, and tall trees wrapping around the sides and back. No other buildings in sight. The only sounds were wind through the trees and the occasional bird. The key was under a loose stone on the porch, just like the rental app said. I stepped inside and took a long breath. Smelled like wood and old blankets. A good smell. Real. The kind you can't fake with candles. It was small but cozy. A twin bed, a wooden desk, a fireplace, a kitchenette with a propane stove, and a tiny bathroom with no shower, just a toilet and a sink. The water came from a well, and the lights worked on a small solar system. I put my phone on airplane mode and tossed it in a drawer. For the first time in years, I felt like I had room to breathe. The first couple of days were peaceful. I read books, went on long walks, cooked simple meals, and slept better than I had in months. I heard animals at night, coyotes maybe, or just raccoons. But I didn't feel scared. The isolation felt good. I chopped some firewood with the rusty axe outside, cleaned out the fireplace, and spent hours just watching the lake behind the cabin shimmer in the sunlight. On the third night, I noticed something strange. I had just finished eating. It was around 8 p.m. I was sitting in one of the rocking chairs on the porch, watching the sky turn dark. I looked up at the corner of the cabin roof and noticed a small shape that looked out of place. I got up, walked to the edge of the porch, and squinted. It was a small dome, clear plastic, half the size of a baseball. It looked like a camera. At first, I told myself it was probably part of a weather sensor. Maybe something the owners put up to monitor storms or snow. But something about it bothered me. It was aimed downward at the porch, and it was mounted cleanly with no sign of rust or wear. I stared at it for a while, then went back inside, trying not to let it ruin my peace, but it stuck in my head. The next morning, I walked around the outside of the cabin and looked more closely. I found 2 more of those little domes. One tucked under the eaves above the back window. One aimed at the clearing where I had parked my car. All of them looked new. All of them were positioned like security cameras. Inside, I started looking harder. I ran my fingers under the shelves, behind the framed pictures of mountains, around the edges of the fireplace. I unscrewed the smoke detector and found nothing. But then I lifted the painting above the bed. It was a print of some lake, and found a small black box mounted into the wall behind it. It was the size of a deck of cards. No wires, just a small lens facing out through a hole drilled in the wooden wall. It was a camera. That was when the comm I'd built started to crack. I pulled the box out of the wall and stuffed it into my backpack. I searched the cabin more carefully now. I found another behind the bookshelf, another inside the light fixture above the kitchen table. Tiny black boxes with lenses, all hidden, all recording. I didn't know what to do. Part of me told myself to leave right away, drive back down the dirt roads, find a motel, call the company that rented the place to me, report everything. But another part of me, the more stubborn part, wanted to know more. Who put them there? Why? And if I left, would they just disappear before anyone else could confirm they were there? I stayed one more night, but I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside made me jump. The camera domes on the roof looked like eyes watching me. I imagined someone sitting in a dark room, watching live footage of me walking around, sleeping, eating. The idea made my skin crawl. I dragged the bed into the middle of the room and slept under a blanket with a flashlight in my hand. The next morning, I hiked farther into the forest, away from the cabin, trying to get a signal. After about 2 hours of walking uphill, I got 2 bars. I called the sheriff's office of the nearest town. No one answered, so I left a message explaining that I was renting a cabin that had hidden cameras inside it. I gave them the location and my number. I also called the rental site's emergency line. They said they'd look into it. I walked back down slowly. I had a deep feeling in my gut that something was wrong, worse than I had realized. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open. I knew I had locked it. Everything inside had been moved. My backpack was dumped out on the floor. The kitchen drawers were all open. The mattress was flipped. Someone had searched the place. I grabbed the axe from the porch, heart hammering, and checked every corner. Whoever it was, they were gone. But they had been inside, and they had searched everything. I checked my car, it was untouched, but all the doors were unlocked. I hadn't left them that way. I didn't sleep that night either. I pushed the dresser in front of the door, sat up with the axe across my knees, and listened. Around 3 a.m., I heard something walking outside the cabin. The boards on the porch creaked. Then silence. The next morning, I packed everything. I was done. As I put my gear in the trunk, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt. Not mine. These were fresh, deep, aggressive treads. A bigger vehicle, maybe a truck. They stopped a few yards from the cabin and backed out the way they came. I drove out fast. I didn't look back. About 30 minutes into the drive, I passed a white pickup parked in the trees on the side of the road. A man was standing beside it, wearing a dark green jacket and jeans, facing away. He didn't move as I passed, just stood there, like he was waiting. I didn't stop. I drove straight into town and went to the sheriff's office in person. I told them everything, showed them the cameras I had taken down, gave them the location. They looked concerned but not surprised. One of the deputies told me that cabin had changed owners twice in the last year. The previous one had been arrested for privacy crimes, but nothing had stuck. It was still under investigation. They said I had done the right thing by leaving. I stayed at a motel that night, couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to that man by the truck, to the cameras I hadn't found, to the porch creaking at night. The worst part was knowing someone had been watching, that they had come back while I was gone. In the following weeks, I kept checking for updates, but there was nothing. The listing disappeared from the rental site. No news, no charges, no confirmation of anything. It was like it had never happened, but I know it did. I kept one of the cameras. I never told anyone. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe I wanted proof for myself. Maybe I wanted to remind myself that even in silence, I was never really alone there. Now, when I see photos of cabins, I scroll past them. I can't go back to the woods. I moved to a different apartment in the city, bought blackout curtains, and sleep with white noise now. People think I'm being paranoid. Maybe I am, but I check my smoke detector once a week. I check every outlet. I check behind every picture frame, because someone out there wanted to watch me, and I don't think they were just curious. I didn't have a reason to go up there other than I needed a break from everything. Work was eating away at me. City noise was driving me up the wall. The same routines, same faces, same buildings. It just felt like I was slowly getting buried under noise and cement. I remembered my uncle once told me he had a cabin up in the mountains way up north, just at the edge of a thick pine forest. He passed a few years ago, and the cabin had been sitting unused since. My aunt didn't want to go there anymore, said it brought her bad memories. I offered to clean it up and maybe stay there for a week. Just me, my car, a few bags, and my thoughts. I packed enough food for about 10 days, canned stuff, dry goods, lots of water, and my camping gear just in case. Brought a small axe, an old hunting knife, and my basic tools. I didn't plan to go hunting or anything. I just liked being ready. There was a generator in the back of the cabin, so I filled 2 red fuel cans before I left. My phone wouldn't have service there, but I kept it on for photos and maybe music. No point trying to talk to anyone anyway. The drive took nearly 8 hours. By the time I turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was hanging low and the trees were closing in on both sides. I had to drive slow. Branches scraped my side mirrors, and I swore I saw some animal shapes moving in the brush more than once. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked like it was holding together out of stubbornness alone. It wasn't falling apart, but it was old. Dusty with siding, moss around the foundation, windows fogged from the inside. Still, I was glad to see it standing. There was a small porch, a single front door, and 2 windows in the front, one for the main room and one for a side bedroom. The roof was metal and looked strong enough. A single chimney stuck out like a broken finger. I parked beside it on a patch of flattened dirt, got out and stretched my legs. The air smelled like pine and cold soil. When I opened the door, the inside smelled like an attic. Dust, old wood, stale air, but nothing rotten. No mold or water damage, just years of stillness. I walked through each room with my flashlight, brushing cobwebs out of the way. The furniture was still there. A couch, a wooden dining table, 2 chairs, a small bed, and a wood-burning stove. In the back room, I found tools, extra gas, and an old hand crank radio. No signs of mice or insects, which surprised me. The place was cleaner than I expected. I opened all the windows and started airing it out. Then I ran the generator for about 30 minutes to check it. Worked fine, but it was loud, so I decided I'd only use it for quick charging or lights if needed. I lit a few candles and ate a cold can of beans while watching the trees shift in the wind. That first night, I barely slept. Every creak in the walls sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind tapping on the windows made me tense. I'm not usually scared of being alone, but that much silence can play tricks on your mind. I stayed awake until sometime past 2 a.m., finally drifting off in the sleeping bag I laid on the bed. Over the next couple of days, I got used to the quiet. I swept the floors, cleared brush from the path to the outhouse, and chopped a few logs to keep near the stove. I didn't need much heat, it was late spring, but the night still dropped down into the low 40s. I explored the woods a little, staying close. I wasn't looking to get lost. I found some deer tracks near the backside of the cabin and a couple of rusted tin cans half buried in leaves. Looked like someone camped here a long time ago. Nothing recent. On the 4th day, I decided to clean the shed behind the cabin. It was smaller, with a rusted lock that snapped open with a screwdriver. Inside were some old tools, scrap wood, a few broken chairs, and a tarp covering something large. When I pulled the tarp away, I found a large wooden hatch in the ground. It had metal hinges and a rope handle, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. At first, I thought it was an old root cellar. Made sense. But when I pulled the hatch open, there was no ladder, just a steep set of wooden steps that led down into darkness. The air that came out was cold and dry. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it down. The basement was about the size of a large bedroom, with stone walls and a dirt floor. The air was dense, like the space hadn't been disturbed in years. I stepped down slowly. My flashlight caught old shelves along one wall, most of them empty except for a few glass jars filled with black sludge. A broken wooden chair was tipped over in the corner. In the far back, I saw a pile of something that looked like canvas or cloth, partly buried in the dirt. I took a few more steps and crouched beside it. It was a tarp, covered in dust and half covered in dirt. I pulled at the edge, and that's when I felt something hard underneath. Not wood, not rock, something smoother. I pulled more of the tarp away and saw it. It was a metal box. At first, I thought it was a toolbox, but it was heavier and had no handle. I wiped the dust off and saw it had a single latch in the front, rusted but still working. I popped it open, and inside were neatly stacked papers. Some were sealed in plastic bags. Others were loose. I pulled one out and held it to the light. They were logs, handwritten notes, dated over a 10-year span. I sat down and started flipping through them. At first, it looked like someone had just used the place as a hideaway. Notes about weather, food, isolation, and thoughts. Then the tone started to shift. Around year 3, the handwriting got shaky. The writer started describing people he thought were watching him through the trees. He wrote that someone had been in the cabin while he was gone. He described hearing movement under the floor at night, scraping, whispering, but there was nothing supernatural about it. No ghosts, just paranoia. He was afraid of real people, stalkers. He said he saw footprints around the cabin in the snow that weren't his. Once he claimed someone left a dead bird nailed to the door. Another time, he said he found the generator running when he knew it had no gas. I read for hours. The last entry was dated 1986. The last sentence was shaky and smeared. It said, "They live underneath." I froze. I looked at the dirt under the box. Something about the way it sloped made me wonder. I moved the tarp aside and started brushing dirt away with my hands. After maybe 10 minutes, I hit something. Wood again, but smoother than the box. Long, flat, and hard. I cleared more dirt. It was a door, like a trap door, but horizontal and buried under at least 2 inches of dirt. There was no handle, just a small metal ring set into the center. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me was screaming not to, but I had to know. I pulled until the ring groaned and lifted the panel up. Underneath was a narrow tunnel. I couldn't see the end. The air smelled like metal and mildew. I stuck my flashlight in and leaned down. The tunnel was maybe 4 feet tall, just wide enough to crawl through. I saw marks on the dirt walls, scratch marks, like someone had dug it by hand. I slammed the panel shut and backed away. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed everything. I was ready to leave, but something made me want to understand what had happened. I read more of the journals. The writer never named himself, but he wrote about the men from below more than once. He said they watched the cabin for months before getting close. He said he once found a boot print under the floorboards. Then another time, he said he heard them talking in low voices under the hatch at night. I didn't believe all of it. Could have been a mentally ill man losing touch. But those scratch marks were real. That tunnel was real, and someone had buried it. The next day, I went back with gloves and my knife. I opened the hatch, went back down, and opened the panel again. I crawled inside just a few feet, enough to shine my light forward. There was a piece of fabric stuck to one side, maybe a shirt fragment. A few feet further in, the tunnel split left and right. I didn't go further. I crawled back and sealed it all again. That evening, I took the journals, locked the shed, and sat by the fire pit thinking. I tried to convince myself that it was all the product of a man losing his grip. But if that were true, why did he bury it all? Why go to such lengths to hide a tunnel? I didn't stay another night. I drove back the next morning. Didn't tell my aunt what I found. I just told her the place was too lonely for me. I kept the journals. They're in a storage box under my bed. A few months later, I looked up missing persons in that region from the 1980s. One man matched the area and time frame. No name, just initials, JT. Last seen hiking near the cabin. Never found. I haven't been back since. But sometimes when it's late and the house is quiet, I think about that tunnel. How it didn't end, it split, went deeper, somewhere, and someone made it. Someone crawled through it. Someone buried it. Someone, or something real. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person who never left. I had been renting out cabins for years, mostly in the spring and fall. When the weather was cooler, the forest stayed quiet, and the roads were less busy. I was never much of a people person, and after I left my job in the city, I found peace being alone in the woods. The cabin I stayed in wasn't fancy. It was an old family-owned place, passed down to me from my uncle when he died. It had no TV, no internet, no neighbors within a mile, and no paved roads leading to it. The driveway was just packed dirt and gravel. Most people would find that inconvenient, but I found it calming. In April of last year, I decided to stay at the cabin for 2 full months. I brought enough supplies, canned food, rice, firewood, propane, bottled water, batteries, everything I could need. I had a truck with big tires and a winch just in case the road got washed out or trees fell. I liked to prepare for the worst. I didn't like surprises. The first week was normal. I spent time chopping wood, cleaning the roof gutters, fixing a loose step on the back porch, and hiking in the nearby woods with my old binoculars. It was just me, the woods, and the occasional deer or raccoon. I saw bear tracks once, but nothing fresh. Nights were cold and quiet with the usual sounds: wind brushing the pines, frogs croaking from the pond out back, and distant owls. I slept deeply and woke up early, just how I liked it. But something changed about 9 or 10 days in. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning to the sound of tires crunching gravel. I knew that sound well. My own truck made it every time I drove in or out. I sat up in bed, heart already racing. The cabin had one bedroom that faced the back of the woods, so the front driveway was out of sight unless I walked to the living room and looked through the front window. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination. There was no reason anyone should be coming up here, especially not in the middle of the night. It wasn't a place people passed by. You had to know the roads, know the turns, and know which unmarked path led to the cabin. There weren't even signs. I got out of bed slowly, didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. I crept into the living room, staying low, and peeked through the window curtain. There was a truck parked in the driveway. It was a dark color, maybe gray or black. I didn't recognize the make, but it looked like an older model, square body, possibly from the 90s. It was coated in dirt, and its headlights were off, engine running quietly. No one got out. It just sat there, humming, for at least a minute or two while I watched. Then the engine cut off. The lights had never turned on. I didn't know what to do. My own truck was parked off to the side, keys inside, but I wasn't about to make a run for it in my boxers at 2:30 in the morning. I grabbed the .22 rifle from above the fireplace. It was more for small animals than protection, but it was something. I stayed by the window another 5 minutes. No movement. No one walked up to the porch. The truck just sat there. Then I saw the driver's side door open slowly, and someone stepped out. The person was wearing jeans and a hoodie with the hood up. They walked slowly, like they weren't in a rush. They didn't come toward the cabin. They walked around to the back of the truck, opened the tailgate, and stood there doing something. I couldn't tell what it was. My heart thumped so hard it made my ears ring. I thought about turning on the porch light, but I didn't want to give away my position. The way I saw it, they hadn't seen me, and maybe if I just stayed quiet, they'd leave. I waited at that window, still and tense, until the person closed the tailgate again and walked back toward the driver's door. But they didn't get in. They leaned on the truck and just stood there facing the woods for what felt like 20 minutes. Eventually, the figure climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and drove back down the driveway slowly with no headlights on. The sound of gravel under tires faded until it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked down the driveway after the sun came up. I wanted to see if there were tire tracks. I knew it wasn't a dream. Sure enough, there were deep tread marks in the dirt, same size as the ones my truck made, but different pattern. They led in and out just like I'd seen. No other signs, no dropped items, no footprints. For the rest of the day, I was on edge. I didn't go into the woods. I stayed close to the cabin, kept the doors locked, even in daylight. Around noon, I drove my truck a mile up the road to see if I could find any signs of the other vehicle. Maybe more tracks or a place where they turned off. But the dirt road past my cabin forked several times, and most of it was surrounded by dense forest. Whoever it was could have gone anywhere. The night after that, I stayed up late, sitting by the window with the rifle. Nothing happened. The woods were quiet again, but I didn't feel the same peace I'd felt before. Every little sound made my shoulders tense. A squirrel rustling in leaves made me flinch. Over the next 3 days, things got weirder. First, I found boot prints behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone out that way. They were spaced far apart, like someone had been walking quickly, and they came from the direction of the woods. They stopped at the back corner of the cabin, then turned around and went back the way they came. It hadn't rained, so the prints stayed clear. Second, I noticed that the metal latch on the shed out back was slightly bent. Not broken, just bent in a way I hadn't seen before. I kept tools in there, shovels, gas cans, and some tarps. Nothing valuable, nothing missing, but the change was enough for me to notice. Then, on the 4th day, I found something that stopped me cold. On the front porch, resting on the top step, was a Polaroid photo. It showed the cabin, my cabin, but the picture had been taken at night. From the tree line, my window glowed faintly from the inside, and in the photo, you could clearly see my silhouette standing by it. It was from the night I'd stood there with the rifle watching the truck. Someone had been watching me from the woods, and I had no idea. My body locked up. I looked around slowly, heart pounding. I didn't hear anything in the woods. I didn't see anyone, but I knew someone had been close enough to take a picture and leave it on my porch without waking me. I grabbed my keys, threw some essentials in a bag, and started the truck. I drove straight to the ranger station about 25 miles out. I told them everything about the truck, the boot prints, the photo. They took it seriously, to their credit. One of the rangers came back with me. We walked the property together. He took the photo and noted the tire treads. He said there had been a few reports recently of remote cabins being scoped out, but nothing solid. Could have been someone looking to steal tools or squat in an empty place. Maybe they didn't expect me to be there. That didn't comfort me. I asked if I should leave. The ranger said it was up to me, but if it were him, he wouldn't stay alone. He advised keeping lights on and locking everything up tight. I left that night. I drove to my sister's place 2 hours away. She didn't ask many questions. I just told her I needed a break. I stayed with her for 3 days before I decided to go back, just to check on things. I didn't like being run out. That cabin was mine, and I wasn't ready to give it up. When I got back, everything was quiet. No new tracks, no signs of entry. I walked through the whole place slowly, rifle in hand. Nothing had been moved. It almost made me feel stupid, like I'd overreacted. But when I went out back to check the shed again, I found something that made my stomach drop. A second photo was taped to the shed door. It showed the inside of the cabin, taken from behind the window. I was sitting on the couch, legs up, reading a book by lantern light. I remembered that night. It was before the truck came, before any of this started. Someone had been watching me for days before I even knew. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed. I kept the blinds open most nights because I liked seeing the moonlight on the trees. I never thought someone would be out there in the cold, crouched in the dark with a camera. That was it for me. I called the county sheriff's office from my truck and reported everything again. I told them I was done staying there. I didn't feel safe. They sent someone out to collect the second photo, and they opened a case file, but they didn't find anything useful. No fingerprints, no DNA, no ID on the truck. I left the cabin and haven't stayed there overnight since. I check on it now and then, during the day when the sun is out and I can see everything around me. But I don't sleep there. Not anymore. The scariest part wasn't the truck, or the photos, or even the knowledge that someone had been so close. It was not knowing why, not knowing what they wanted, how long they'd been watching, or what they would have done if I hadn't spotted them that night. Maybe they got scared off. Maybe they were planning something worse. I'll never know. I still live in the same part of the state, but I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't trust the quiet like I used to, and every now and then, when I walk past a window at night and catch my reflection, I think about that first photo, the one where I stood by the glass thinking I was the one watching. But really, I was the one being watched. I remember the first time I saw that cabin on a hiking trip about 6 years ago. It sat at the end of an old logging road, tucked between two ridges deep in the northern woods. Nobody lived in it full-time, but it was kept in good shape, probably a seasonal hunting cabin. After that trip, I couldn't stop thinking about it. A year later, through a friend of a friend, I got in touch with the guy who owned it. He was an older man who didn't use it much anymore. I offered to pay him a few $100 a year to use it whenever it was available. He agreed. That was how it all started. I usually only went in the warmer months, late spring to early fall, when the roads weren't buried in snow and the animals weren't too aggressive. But in early November last year, I felt like I needed a break from everything. Work was stressing me out, I wasn't sleeping well, and I was falling into some bad habits again. I figured a week alone in the cabin would help. No phone signal, no internet, no other people. Just trees, silence, and cold air. The first warning sign should have been how quiet the guy was when I told him I was heading up there in November. He said I could go, but added something like, "There's not much going on out there this time of year. Be careful." I didn't think anything of it. I packed up my truck with enough food for 7 days, a generator, fuel, tools, a propane heater, sleeping bag, everything. I brought my hunting rifle too. Not that I planned to hunt, but you never know out there. I left early on a Sunday. The first few hours of the drive were easy, but once I left the main roads, the path turned rough. The trail leading to the cabin wasn't really a road anymore, just dirt and scattered rocks weaving through thick trees. With the recent rains, it was half mud. My truck slid a few times on the way up. I passed no other cars. At one point, a large tree branch had fallen across the trail, and I had to winch it out of the way. It added almost 2 hours to the trip. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the hills. The place looked just like I remembered. It was small, square, built of old logs but solid. One window in the front, 2 in the back, all with thick shutters. The door was heavy and bolted with steel from the inside. It always felt more like a fort than a cabin, probably because the guy who built it was a hunter and paranoid about bears. I unloaded everything and got the heater going. By the time I sat down with a sandwich and a beer, it was pitch black outside. Not a single light anywhere, just woods. The first night was normal, cold but quiet. I heard wind moving through the trees and some branches cracking, but nothing unusual. I read a little by lantern light, then went to bed in the sleeping bag. I slept all the way through. The next morning, I stepped outside to use the bathroom, just an outhouse behind the cabin, and I noticed something odd. There were tracks near the front of the cabin. Not animal tracks, boot prints. Someone had walked up to the door and then walked away again. At first, I thought maybe they were mine, but mine went off toward the outhouse and back. These ones went straight toward the door and back down the trail. I checked the door. Locked, no signs of damage. The windows were still shut tight. I tried to forget about it, telling myself maybe they were old. Maybe someone had come by last week or something. Still, it was strange. No one else was supposed to be up here. I spent most of that day chopping wood and organizing gear. I hiked about a mile around the area too, just to get familiar with the land again. I didn't see anyone. No cabins, no tents, no signs of other people at all. Just woods, deer trails, and one coyote carcass half-rotted under a bush. Looked like it had been torn up by something big. Could have been a bear. Could have been wolves. That night, I locked the door tight and slid the heavy bar across it. I fell asleep around 10. I woke up maybe 2 hours later to a dull thud against the side of the cabin. Not a loud one, but enough to make me open my eyes. I stayed quiet and listened. I heard something brushing against the logs, slow footsteps around the outside, then silence. I sat up and kept listening. The generator was off since I shut it down at night to save fuel, so there was no noise except the wind and my own heartbeat. Then, just as I was starting to think I imagined it, I heard a soft scrape against the front door. Not hard, just a drag, like someone's hand or an object sliding down the wood. I got my flashlight and slowly stood up. I didn't want to make noise, didn't want to alert whoever or whatever was out there. I peeked through the side window, but saw nothing, just black trees. I waited at the door for almost 30 minutes, rifle in hand, heart pounding. Eventually, I went back to the sleeping bag and laid there, eyes open until morning. When daylight came, I walked the perimeter. More boot tracks, same pattern, up to the door, then away. No sign of forced entry, no damage, just those damn tracks. That was the first moment I started seriously considering packing up and leaving. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hunter who got lost, or someone checking if the cabin was occupied. Maybe they meant no harm, but still, I didn't like it. I stayed a third night, mostly because I didn't want to seem like I was scared off by something so minor. But that night, everything got worse. I shut down the generator again after cooking dinner, cleaned up, then bolted the door and windows like always. I kept the rifle closer this time. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was someone moving fast through the trees outside. Not walking, running. I heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Then they stopped. A few minutes later, something hit the wall hard. This time it wasn't subtle. A full thud, like a shoulder or body slammed into the back wall. I jumped up and aimed the rifle at the window. Another bang, this time near the side. Then another. Whoever it was, they were circling, hitting different parts of the cabin. I shouted out, not words, just noise, to try and scare them off. No answer, just silence. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A creak on the roof. They were on top of the cabin. I aimed straight up and held still, breathing slow. The sound of slow steps moving across the roof. Then silence. Nothing for a long time. I didn't sleep at all. I sat against the front door until the sun rose. When I finally opened it, I saw no one. But on the roof, there were muddy boot prints, clear as day, and more tracks around the cabin. Still the same boots. Still alone. I packed up most of my gear that morning, planning to leave early the next day. I didn't want to drive the trail down in the dark, but I wanted to be ready. I kept the heater running through the day just to stay calm, but I barely ate anything. My stomach felt tight. Every noise outside made me freeze. The fourth night, I didn't shut off the generator. I wanted light even if it burned through fuel. I pushed the heavy couch in front of the door and sat in the corner with the rifle across my lap. I didn't lie down. I didn't even blink much. For hours, it was quiet. Then, just before 2 a.m., the lights flickered. Once, then again. Then they died. I ran outside to check the generator. It had been smashed. Not turned off, smashed. Someone had hit it with something heavy and cracked the housing wide open. Fuel spilled all over the dirt. I turned around and scanned the trees with my flashlight. I didn't see anyone, but the air felt wrong, like something was watching me. I ran back in, barred the door, and kept the flashlight on. It started dying an hour later. The batteries were low. I had more, but I didn't want to make noise searching for them. I sat in the dark. Then I heard breathing, right outside the front door. Not loud, just slow, steady breathing. It lasted for several minutes. Then I heard footsteps walking away. Not running, walking. Slow, deliberate. At first light, I threw everything I could into the truck and got out. I didn't clean the cabin. I didn't check for more tracks. I just drove. The trail was slick and steep, and I nearly lost control twice, but I didn't stop. I drove until I reached the nearest gas station 3 hours later. I stayed in my truck that night, parked under the bright lights of the lot, engine running. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I told the owner I wouldn't be renewing the deal. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask why. He just said okay and wished me well. I've thought a lot about what happened, who that was, why they didn't try to break in, why they didn't speak. Just watching, circling, walking the roof, smashing the generator. There was something calculated in the way they moved. Not drunk, not crazy, calm, controlled, like they knew how long I'd last. I don't think they wanted to kill me. I think they wanted to break me, to see how many nights I could handle before I ran. I still dream about the cabin sometimes, not in a nightmare way, just quiet dreams, where I'm sitting in the dark, waiting for footsteps, always waiting, and always waking up before the door opens. I was getting tired of the noise. It had been building up in my head for weeks. Cars outside my apartment, the constant hum of city traffic, footsteps from the neighbor upstairs, the clinking of dishes, the sudden honking, even my own phone vibrating nonstop. Every little thing had started to wear me down. I felt like I couldn't think straight anymore. My job required deep focus. I wrote technical manuals for a living, the kind of work that needed complete silence. Deadlines were piling up and I kept falling behind. So I made a decision. I searched online and found a listing for a remote cabin tucked away deep in the mountains in the north. The pictures looked good: wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a simple bed, and a big wooden desk next to a wide window. There was no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, and no neighbors within miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I rented it for 10 days. I packed everything carefully. Mostly clothes, a laptop with extra batteries, power bank, my solar charger, a small cooler filled with food, a propane stove, a big water container, a flashlight, and a few tools just in case. I even brought a small hand axe and some bear spray, more out of caution than fear. The drive took nearly 8 hours. The last hour was rough. The paved road ended and the dirt trail that led up the slope was narrow, rocky, and uneven. I had to drive slowly. Trees grew thick on both sides, with barely any space between them, and the deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. Finally, I reached the clearing. The cabin stood just where the GPS coordinates had pointed. It looked older than in the pictures. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof slightly slanted, the front steps a bit crooked, but it was solid. There were no other structures around, just trees and the faint shape of the mountains in the distance. The air smelled of pine and cold soil. It was quiet, too quiet. I parked, turned off the engine, and stepped out. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. Nothing. No birds, no wind, no buzzing insects. Just the kind of deep silence that feels almost too heavy. But I shrugged it off and unloaded the car. Inside, the cabin was simple but livable. One big room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, an old table, and the desk near the window. There was a small bathroom with a dry toilet and a metal basin for washing. The walls creaked a little, but they were solid. I bolted the door, checked the window latches, and unpacked. The first night was fine. I heated a can of soup on my stove, wrote a few pages on my laptop, and went to sleep early. It got cold fast, so I used the thick sleeping bag I brought. I fell asleep listening to the crackling of the wood stove. The second day, I got into the rhythm. Woke up early, made instant coffee, worked for hours without distraction. My mind felt clear for the first time in weeks. Outside, the woods were still silent. No birds, no animals, just stillness. It struck me as strange, but I kept working. It was that night when I started to feel something was wrong. I was brushing my teeth near the basin when I heard a sound outside. Not loud, just a small thud, like something dropping onto the ground. I stopped. My ears were sharp from the silence. I stood completely still and listened. Nothing. I went to the window and looked out. The trees were still. The dirt trail was empty. The woods didn't move. I turned off the light inside to see more clearly, but even then, there was nothing out of place. Still, the sound stayed in my mind. I didn't sleep as well that night. The third day, I worked again. Tried not to think about the sound. Maybe it was a pine cone falling or a branch dropping. Could have been anything, but I kept the bear spray closer just in case. That afternoon, I stepped out for a short walk. I hadn't left the cabin since I arrived. I followed a narrow footpath behind the cabin that led into the trees. The trail curved slightly and sloped downward. After 10 minutes of walking, I stopped. There were boot prints, not mine. I checked the soles of my own boots, completely different tread. These were heavier, with a thicker sole, and they went in both directions, toward the cabin and back away from it. I stood there for a long time, just staring. My breath felt tighter in my chest. The prints weren't old. No leaves had fallen into them. The edges were sharp, maybe a day old, maybe less. I turned back. That night, I didn't cook. I just ate crackers straight from the bag and drank water. I double-checked all the locks. I shut the window curtains and sat in the dark with my flashlight beside me. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A soft crunch. Leaves under a foot. Then again. Closer this time. Then a pause. Then a long, slow creak would bending under weight. The front steps. I didn't move. My hand was around the bear spray can, my heart racing. I didn't dare stand or make a sound. The noise didn't come again. No knock. No attempt to open the door. Nothing. It stayed like that until dawn. When the sun came up, I forced myself to open the door. The steps looked the same, but there was a new mark. Dust and mud scraped on the edge of the second plank. I looked around. Nothing but trees and cold air. But the silence now felt full, like something was just out of sight. I wanted to leave, but the road was narrow and I couldn't risk trying to drive it at night if this person was out there. So I stayed. I decided I needed to set a trap or something to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I took a piece of thread from my repair kit and tied it across the steps at ankle height. If someone came up again, they'd trip it. I spread a thin layer of flour outside the door too, a trick I'd heard hunters use. If anything stepped in it, I'd see the print. Then I waited. That night, I didn't sleep again. I sat at the desk with the lights off, staring at the door. At 1:47 a.m., I heard the thread snap, then a footstep, then another, then stillness. I didn't move. I held my breath for over a minute. Then I slowly turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the floor. I saw the flour disturbed, wiped in a wide half-circle pattern, like someone tried to erase their steps with their foot. But they had stepped too close. A clear boot print, not mine. I felt a wave of cold in my chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I stayed frozen like that until daylight. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my keys, threw everything I could back into my bag, and went to the car. I didn't care about the rest of the stuff. I didn't care about my laptop or the work or even the food. I just wanted to get out. I unlocked the car door and stopped. The back seat door was slightly open. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even sat back there. I looked inside. Nothing seemed taken. Nothing moved. But there were small pine needles scattered on the seat. My chest tightened again. Whoever it was had been inside my car. I slammed the door, locked it, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. The road was rough, but I didn't care. I drove fast, letting the tires bounce and jolt. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I made it down the trail and back to the paved road. Only then did I stop and breathe. I looked at my phone. Signal returned. I had 12 missed calls from work and a few spam texts. Nothing else. I kept driving. Back at home, I filed a police report. They took it down but didn't seem interested. Said it was probably a squatter or some local hunter. They never followed up. I didn't care. I had no intention of ever going back. I broke my lease on the cabin and deleted the contact information. I bought new locks for my apartment and checked them twice every night. For a while, I thought I was overreacting. Maybe I imagined some of it. Maybe the silence got to me. But 1 month later, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a flash drive. Only one file on it. A photo. A photo of me, asleep in the cabin bed, taken from just a few feet away. I moved the next day. I've never gone back to the woods. I don't plan to. I never told anyone. Not my family, not my friends. I deleted the photo, smashed the flash drive, and threw it in a dumpster far from home. I kept the bear spray near my bed for weeks after, and I never again looked for silence in places where no one else lives. Because sometimes you're not alone, even when it feels like it. Especially when it feels like it. And if you think I imagined any of it, if you think it's just stress or paranoia or too much time alone, then go ahead. Find your own quiet little cabin deep in the mountains, and stay a few nights. Just listen carefully. You'll know. I had been staying in that old cabin for nearly 5 days before things started getting strange. I went out there to be alone, to take a break from everything. Life in the city had started to grind me down in ways I hadn't really understood until I got away from it. The noise, the people, the constant rush. It had all become too much. I found the cabin online through a local listing, deep in a forested part of the state where there were no towns for miles. It wasn't a fancy rental, just an old off-grid wooden cabin that someone's grandfather built back in the 1960s. No electricity, no running water, just a basic wood stove, some jugs of drinking water, and a composting toilet out back. The guy I rented it from met me at a gas station 30 miles away, handed me a key, and pointed me in the direction of the dirt road that led to it. I didn't expect luxury. I wanted quiet, and that's what I got. The trees were thick, mostly pine and some old oaks. There was a narrow creek that wound down not too far from the cabin. I could hear it at night when everything else went still. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up when the sun came through the small windows, made coffee over a propane stove, read books, and chopped some wood. I brought a few supplies in coolers and a lot of dry food. I barely used my phone because there was no signal unless I hiked a mile uphill behind the cabin. Even then, only one bar would blink in and out. That was exactly what I wanted. I spent most of the days walking the trail behind the cabin, down to the creek and back. It was early spring, so things were still kind of wet, but the snow was long gone. The moss on the trees was damp, and the trail had a spongy feel beneath my boots. The woods were alive in a quiet sort of way. No loud birds, no animal calls, just that faint sound of water moving and the wind brushing over treetops. I saw some deer on the second day. They watched me from a distance and ran off when I stepped closer. I didn't see any other big animals, but I knew bears and mountain lions lived in that area. That didn't bother me much. I grew up hiking and I was used to being cautious. On the 5th day, I started hearing something strange near the creek. It wasn't loud. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy across wet gravel. At first, I thought maybe it was just a branch or a log that had fallen into the water and was scraping along the bottom as it moved with the current. But it didn't go away. Every time I walked down there, I'd hear it for a while, then it would stop when I got close to the water. I looked around every time, but I never saw anything. The creek wasn't very wide, maybe 5 or 6 feet across, and the water was shallow. I could see the bottom clearly, just rocks, mud, and a few leaves. No signs of animals, no fish, no people. I figured maybe I was just getting spooked for no reason. That night, as I sat outside the cabin on a little folding chair I'd brought, I heard it again. It was fainter from that distance, but the dragging sound was there, followed by a dull thump. I waited, listening. It didn't repeat. I stood up and stared in the direction of the creek, which was out of sight beyond the trees. Nothing moved. The wind was still. I went back inside and bolted the door. The next morning, I walked to the creek first thing. The dragging noise was gone, but something else caught my attention. On the far bank, the mud had deep marks in it. It looked like someone had tried to pull something heavy out of the water. The tracks weren't boot prints or animal prints, just 2 long grooves, side by side, stretching from the edge of the creek into the woods. They looked fresh. I crouched down and touched them. The mud was still moist, and a few pine needles clung to the edge of the marks. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before they disappeared into thicker undergrowth. Whatever it was, it had been dragged in a straight line and then veered off. I stood there, scanning the trees, but everything was still. I had that feeling you get when you know you're being watched, but you can't see who or what is watching. I backed out and walked back to the cabin more quickly than I normally would. That day, I stayed inside. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe an old tree branch fell and got caught in the current. Maybe it scraped against the bank when the water level rose during the rain the night before. But something about the tracks didn't sit right with me. That night, I heard it again. Closer, much closer. The dragging sound came from just beyond the tree-line, maybe 30 feet from the front of the cabin. It moved slowly, scrape, scrape, thump. I sat on the edge of the cot with my boots still on, holding the only thing I had that could count as a weapon, a thick piece of firewood. The dragging stopped. I didn't move, I sat there, staring at the door, my ears straining for the slightest noise. A few minutes passed. Then I heard footsteps. Not quick, not loud, just steady. Crunching dry twigs. I froze. They circled the cabin once. I heard them move past the window, then the sidewall, then the back. Then silence. I stayed like that until the sun came up. When it did, I went out with a long-handled axe I kept near the woodpile and checked around. I saw nothing. No prints. No tracks. No broken branches. Just forest. But something had been under the cabin. I noticed some of the leaves and pine needles pushed aside right near the crawlspace hatch in the back. It wasn't locked. Just a wooden board you could slide aside. I got on my knees and lifted it. The space was about 2 feet high and stretched under the whole cabin. I shined a flashlight in, expecting to see raccoons or maybe signs of a burrow. But all I saw was a dark shape, deep in the far corner. I couldn't tell what it was, but it wasn't natural. It was too square. I didn't go in. I dropped the board and stepped back. That day, I packed most of my things. I planned to leave the next morning. The road out was rough, and I didn't want to drive it in the dark. I double-checked the tires on my SUV and made sure the key was where I left it. Then I locked the cabin door and stayed awake all night, waiting. Just after midnight, the dragging came back. This time, it didn't stop at the trees. It came straight toward the cabin. I heard it come right up to the wall, then pause. Then something brushed against the wood, a long scrape. I grabbed the axe and waited, breathing shallow. Suddenly, the front doorknob turned. It didn't rattle. It turned slow, like whoever was outside thought it might be unlocked. When it didn't open, it stopped. Then the footsteps moved around the cabin again. I went to the back window and peeked out from under the curtain. Someone was standing by the crawlspace hatch. They were hunched over, dragging something behind them. A long, dark bundle wrapped in a plastic tarp. I couldn't see the face. The figure was in a thick jacket and muddy jeans, and they had gloves on. They knelt and started pulling the bundle under the cabin through the hatch. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched. It took them a long time to push it all the way in. Then they crawled in after it and pulled the hatchboard shut behind them. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my backpack, tossed it in the car, and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't call the police right away. I didn't even tell anyone for a few days. I just tried to forget it. But then I saw something on the local news about a missing hiker. A woman in her 30s, last seen heading into the woods about 40 miles from where the cabin was. Her car was found near a trailhead, but she never came out. I called the county sheriff and told them everything. I gave them the location of the cabin and explained what I saw. They went out there with dogs and a search team. They found the crawl space. They found the tarp. Inside it was a body, wrapped in blankets and duct tape. Female. Clothes matched the description of the missing hiker. They never found the man I saw. The cabin owner said he hadn't been out there in months. He had no idea how anyone else could have gotten the key. My fingerprints were on the door and the crawlspace hatch, but the police cleared me. I told them everything, exactly how it happened. I even gave them my phone and GPS logs to show when I left. They kept the cabin as a crime scene for weeks. The body had been there less than 3 days, according to the coroner. Cause of death was blunt force trauma. No signs of sexual assault. No robbery. Just a clean, precise kill and a hidden body. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still see that shape in my dreams, the man dragging the tarp, crawling under the floor of that cabin like it was routine, like he'd done it before, like he was used to the dark. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the wind brushes against the side of my apartment building, it sounds like that long, low scrape I heard out there, and I freeze again, every time. I wanted a break. That was all. I wasn't looking for trouble, wasn't chasing anything exciting, and definitely didn't expect things to go the way they did. I just wanted a quiet place to sit for a few days with no phone, no traffic, no noise. Just me, some books, some basic food, and fresh air. That's why I booked the cabin. I found it listed on a basic-looking rental site. Nothing fancy. The pictures looked decent. It was small, made of dark wood, with one front window and a porch that faced a bunch of pine trees. The listing said it was 20 minutes from the nearest town and about a mile from an abandoned quarry. The price was low, which I liked, and there were no reviews, but it didn't bother me. I figured it was just new on the site. It was mid-September, which meant fewer tourists around. I packed light: clothes, instant food, water bottles, a few tools, flashlights, a first aid kit, and some firewood I bought from a gas station on the way. I drove up early in the morning on a Tuesday. The road narrowed as I went further up the hills. After a while, my phone lost signal completely, which I expected. I had downloaded offline maps, so I kept going. By late morning, I arrived at a rough dirt road with a rusty sign pointing to the property. The road was steep and uneven, filled with rocks and potholes. It took almost 15 minutes of slow driving to reach the cabin. When I finally parked in front of it, I took a moment to step out and stretch. The air was colder than I thought it would be, with that crisp scent of pine needles and old earth. There was no wind, just stillness. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but it was fine. One small room with a bed, a chair, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom in the back. There was no power. The place ran on propane and battery lanterns. The bathroom had a composting toilet, and the water was from a rain collection tank. I wasn't expecting luxury anyway. The porch had an old rocking chair and a small table. From the porch, the trees blocked most of the view, but I could hear the faint sound of wind in the branches and the occasional bird call. Felt peaceful. I settled in, unpacked what I needed, and made a small meal. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading a book on the porch with a blanket over my legs. The sunlight faded slowly through the trees, and by the time the sky turned orange, the temperature dropped enough that I went inside to get warmer. That night, I made a small fire in the wood stove and lit a lantern. It was silent except for the ticking of the metal as it heated up and cooled down. I ate, read, and went to sleep early. I thought I'd sleep well, but I kept waking up. Not from noise, not from dreams, just this uneasy feeling, like something was off. I'd wake, check the time, and lie there listening. No footsteps, no creaking floors, just the cabin breathing with the cold night air. I chalked it up to unfamiliarity and tried to ignore it. The second day, I woke up early, made oatmeal with water I boiled on the stove, then went for a walk. I followed the dirt road past the cabin and turned off toward the quarry trail. The trees here were thick, and the path was overgrown in spots. The sun was out, but barely cut through the branches above. I had my GPS on my offline map, so I felt confident about not getting lost. After about half an hour, I reached the edge of the quarry. It was deeper than I expected. A huge bowl carved out of the earth, steep walls all around, with water collected at the bottom. The water was still and dark. A few pieces of rusted equipment sat near the edges, and there were no fences or warning signs, just silence. I sat on a rock overlooking it for a while, thinking about the kind of work that used to go on there. Maybe they mined stone, maybe gravel. Whatever it was, it hadn't been active in a long time. There were tire tracks nearby, but they looked old. Heading back to the cabin, I noticed something, a set of footprints. Not mine. These were wider, deeper, with a boot pattern I didn't recognize. They weren't there when I first walked through. I followed them for a bit, but they veered off into the woods. I didn't want to get sidetracked, so I headed back. That evening, I sat on the porch again. I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. Maybe a hunter, or someone else using the land without permission. I knew I wasn't trespassing. I had the papers printed out and signed. Still, it made me a little uneasy. That night was worse than the first. I woke up around 1 a.m. to a soft thud outside. Not loud, not fast, just a single sound, like something heavy shifting or dropping. I sat up in bed and waited. Nothing followed it. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear leaves crunching. Just that single thump. I didn't go outside to check. I waited. Then I drifted back to sleep eventually, but it was light and broken. In the morning, I found something odd. The firewood pile had been moved. Not by much, Just one log placed a few feet from the stack, in the middle of the dirt near the steps. I hadn't done that. It hadn't rolled there either. It was heavy and needed effort to carry. It rattled me. I kept looking around the trees, listening for movement, but everything was quiet. I didn't see anyone. No new footprints. But I knew something had been near. I stayed close to the cabin that day. I spent some time cleaning, chopping more kindling, and organizing supplies. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. I kept checking the window every time I heard anything, even the smallest rustle. That evening, I locked the cabin door, even though I wasn't sure how useful the old lock would be. I put a chair under the doorknob too. I didn't light a lantern. I sat quietly, trying to stay alert. I ate cold food. The wind picked up that night, and the trees outside moaned softly as they moved. I didn't sleep much. At around 3 a.m., I heard something again. Not just one sound this time. It was footsteps, slow on dry leaves and twigs. They circled around the cabin, careful and measured. I froze. Every part of me was awake. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loudly. I just sat on the bed with the blanket pulled up to my chest. Then silence. No knock. No words. Just nothing. I waited until the sun started to rise before I opened the door. I didn't see anyone, but I did see new tracks again. Fresh and this time much closer. Someone had come up right to the window. I decided then that I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything up. I kept a hatchet in my belt, and I loaded the car quickly. I took photos of the footprints, of the firewood, of the area near the window, and I left around mid-morning. But here's the thing. The road out was blocked. A tree had fallen right across it. A thick, heavy pine tree, and it wasn't rotten. It looked like it had been cut. The break was too clean. I panicked a bit then. I got out, looked around, and tried to stay calm. No one was there. I tried to move the tree, but it was too heavy. Even the branches were dense. I didn't have the right tools to clear it fully. No chainsaw, just a hatchet and a basic handsaw. It took me hours just to cut a gap wide enough to squeeze the car through the side where the embankment dipped. I scratched the entire passenger side against branches and rocks, but I didn't care. As I drove out, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone. I made it to the main road by sunset, finally got signal again, and drove straight to the nearest town. I stopped at a gas station and sat in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes just breathing. I didn't even fill up the tank at first. I just sat there. Eventually, I went in, used the bathroom, and bought a coffee. I looked rough in the mirror. Bags under my eyes, dirt on my face, a small cut on my hand I hadn't even noticed earlier. I didn't go to the police. I know people say you should, but I didn't. What was I going to say? Someone walked around my cabin at night? Moved a log? Cut a tree? They'd shrug. There were no threats, no damage to property, no injuries. Nothing stolen. I sent the owner a message through the site when I got back home. I told them the area didn't feel safe and they might want to check for trespassers. I never got a reply. The listing disappeared a few days later. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they were living near the quarry or if they just came up the hills sometimes to watch people. I don't know if they had a plan or if they were just messing with me. But I know this. Someone was there. Someone watched me, and they didn't want me to leave. I don't rent cabins anymore. Not ones without cell service. Not ones near abandoned places. And not ones that are too cheap. I needed a break from everything. City noise, constant traffic, crowded stores, and people everywhere had been wearing me down for years. I couldn't remember the last time I felt calm. Not rushed. Not checking my phone every few minutes. Not hearing sirens or horns. So when my cousin told me about a cabin his friend was renting out near an abandoned rock quarry way up north, I jumped on it. He said it was deep in the woods, no neighbors, no cell service, no electricity, just propane for heat, a big water tank, and a hand pump outside. Sounded perfect. I didn't need much. I just wanted quiet, to be alone, to rest my mind. I packed the basics. Canned food, dry goods, water, flashlights, spare batteries, a small propane stove, a sleeping bag, my boots, a few books, a map, and some tools just in case. I left my phone at home on purpose. No distractions. I even wrote a note and taped it to my door saying I'd be gone for a week and not to worry. No one needed me that badly. It was a long drive, 8 hours straight. The last hour was all dirt road, bouncing and sliding over gravel, with trees leaning in from both sides so tightly the road felt like a tunnel. My cousin gave me directions that ended with, "Drive past the quarry turnoff and park where the road narrows. There's a trail leading down to the cabin. It's about a 10-minute walk." He wasn't lying. After I passed a rusty metal gate with faded warning signs about blasting and loose rock, the trees grew thicker. I found the small pull-off he mentioned and parked. No one around. The quiet was heavy, like a blanket. The trail was narrow but clear, winding between tall pine trees and thick undergrowth. I could smell the forest. Damp earth, pine needles, and something like moss or fungus. I passed a few giant rocks, almost the size of small cars, probably leftover from the quarry days. The trail dropped steeply for a while, then opened up into a small clearing with the cabin in the center. It was old but solid, weathered wood, metal roof, a stone chimney, and small windows. A stack of chopped firewood leaned against one wall. The place looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I unlocked the door with the key my cousin gave me and stepped inside. It smelled musty but dry. There was a metal bed frame with a mattress, a wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and shelves with old pots and pans. No lights, just daylight through the windows. I dropped my bag, took a deep breath, and felt the tension start to slip away. The first day passed slowly, and I liked that. I unpacked, swept the floor, lit the stove, and boiled some water for instant coffee. I sat outside and listened to the wind in the trees. It was peaceful. I read a little, wrote in my notebook, ate some canned beans, and went to bed early. The night was so dark it felt like the cabin had been dropped into space. The only sound was the wind and the occasional creak of the roof. I fell asleep fast. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. The air was cold. I went outside and saw deer tracks near the trees. I spent the day walking around, following the tree line, and exploring the area behind the cabin. I found what looked like an old service trail, overgrown and barely visible, but it ran along the edge of a steep drop where I could see part of the quarry far below. Giant slabs of rock, broken machinery, and pools of water filled the basin. It looked dead, abandoned, like the earth had swallowed it and left it half digested. I didn't go down. I just looked for a while, then walked back to the cabin before dark. The third day, I started hearing things. Not voices or anything like that, just odd sounds. A metallic clank here and there, like something falling and hitting rock. I figured it was just old equipment shifting in the quarry or maybe an animal knocking something over. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear footsteps or talking, so I brushed it off. That night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up sweating. The fire in the stove had gone out, so it was cold, but I was drenched. I sat up, heart racing, and didn't know why. The cabin was dark and quiet, but I had that feeling like I wasn't alone. I stayed still for a long time, listening. Nothing. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I saw something strange. About 20 feet from the cabin, near the base of a tree, I noticed a rock that looked like it had been moved. It was flat, and underneath it was a small hole in the ground. Not deep, but clean, like someone had dug it with their hands. Nothing was inside, just empty space. It gave me a weird feeling. I covered it again and tried not to think about it. That afternoon, I decided to go down into the quarry. I packed water, snacks, and a flashlight, and followed the service trail to a path that looked like it would lead down. It was steeper than I expected and slippery with loose gravel. I had to move slow. At the bottom, it was quiet in a different way, like sound couldn't escape. The rock walls towered on all sides. Old machines sat rusting in place, drills, trucks, conveyor belts. Some were half buried in debris. I walked around for an hour or so, taking pictures with the disposable camera I brought. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. Near the far end, under a metal platform, was a pile of small bones. Dozens of them. They weren't animal bones, at least not any I recognized. Too small for deer, too many for a rabbit or bird. I crouched and looked closer. Some were snapped clean. I didn't touch them. I just stood up and walked back to the trail, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something outside, light crunches on the ground, soft shifting sounds. At one point, I sat up and thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but it could have been wind in the trees. I stayed inside the next day. I didn't feel safe. I checked around the cabin and noticed more rocks had been moved. Flat ones, round ones, like someone was digging little holes and covering them again. They were all empty. Some near trees, some near the path, one right next to the water pump. I started marking them with sticks to keep track. That night, I stayed awake with a hatchet in one hand and my flashlight in the other. At around 2 a.m., I heard a sharp metal clatter from behind the cabin. I jumped and ran to the back window, turned off the flashlight, and watched. I couldn't see anything for a while. Then I caught movement, slow, steady. Figure, human, walking hunched over. Not rushing, not lost, just moving deliberately. I held my breath. The figure disappeared behind a tree. I waited and waited. It never came out again. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I found more of the small holes. 2 of them were near where I saw the figure. One had a small piece of cloth inside, faded red, dirty, torn. I didn't touch it. I backed away and sat on the steps of the cabin, shaking. I was supposed to stay the whole week, but by day 5, I knew I couldn't. Something was wrong here. Someone was out there, watching, digging, creeping. I packed everything quickly. Before I left, I decided to do one last walk around to check the path. When I circled the cabin, I found a new hole bigger than the others. It wasn't covered, and next to it was a shovel, an old, rusted shovel with a broken handle. I hadn't seen it before. I stared at it for a long time. The hole was about the length of a person, maybe 3 feet deep. No animal digs like that. It wasn't an animal. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my bag, and bolted up the trail. I didn't look back. My car was still where I left it. I threw my stuff in the back, turned the key, and drove as fast as I could. Gravel flew behind me. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That someone was digging holes around my cabin? That I saw bones in the quarry? That a man-shaped shadow circled my window in the middle of the night? It's been months now. I still think about it. I've looked up that area online, tried to find old news about the quarry. Nothing. No missing person reports, no history of crime. Just a name and a date when the quarry shut down in the late 90s. But the thing that still haunts me, the part one can't shake, is this. Someone was digging those holes around the cabin, and they weren't looking for something. They were preparing a place to put something. Maybe me. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I wanted to be away from everything. I was tired of the noise, the pressure, the people. Every day felt like too much. Phones, traffic, work, obligations. I wasn't handling it well. My mind felt full and heavy all the time, like it was always rushing, and I never had a minute to breathe. It had been like that for over a year. I thought maybe it was burnout, but it felt deeper than that. I started snapping at people for no reason. I started drinking more. Then came the insomnia. I'd lay awake all night staring at the ceiling, and then by morning I felt like a husk of myself. I realized I needed to get away from everything before I broke down completely. I took a month off work. I didn't tell most people where I was going. I found an old rental cabin deep in the woods through a small classified listing website. No big booking platform, no reviews, nothing fancy. It was cheap and far, about a 5-hour drive away into the northern edge of the state, near the edge of a national forest. The guy renting it out only responded with 2 sentences in his email. Key is under the rock. You'll have privacy. That was all I needed. I packed light. Some canned food, dry goods, clothes, batteries, a flashlight, a small hatchet, a blanket, 2 paperbacks, and a notebook. I didn't plan to use my phone except to check the time. I wanted peace. No screens, no internet, no people. Just stillness. The road got narrower and bumpier the closer I got to the cabin. There was no one around, no gas stations, no towns for miles. just woods and quiet and sky. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was overgrown, and I had to park and walk the last half-mile. When I got there, the place looked old but sturdy. The wood was weathered gray, the front steps creaked, and the windows were dirty, but it didn't look broken or unsafe. It had a small porch and sat a few dozen yards from the edge of the forest. I found the key under a flat rock, just like the owner said. Inside, the air was dusty and dry. The furniture was simple: one couch, one table, one chair, and a small bed in the back room. There was a wood stove in the corner and some chopped logs stacked beside it. No electricity, no plumbing. A hand pump outside provided water, and there was an outhouse about 30 yards into the woods. I spent the first day settling in. I swept the floor, opened the windows, checked the drawers. Everything felt untouched. There were cobwebs in the corners, a thick layer of dust on the bookshelf. The canned goods in the cabinet were expired by a few years, so I threw them out. I unpacked my food and gear. I set up my small camp stove and lit a fire that night. For the first time in months, I felt like I could hear my own thoughts. The next few days were calm. I wrote in my notebook, read a little, went on long walks, collected kindling, and just sat for long periods doing nothing. It rained the second night, and the sound on the roof was the only thing I heard. I didn't miss my phone or the news or people. I felt lighter, like something was slowly draining out of me that had built up for a long time. But something started feeling wrong on the fourth day. It was small at first. I went out in the morning to collect more firewood, and I noticed footprints in the mud near the edge of the cabin. Not mine. They were a bit smaller than my boots and going in the opposite direction from where I usually walk. They circled the cabin once and disappeared into the trees. I stared at them for a while. Could have been old, I told myself. Could have been someone else who stayed here before. Maybe the owner came to check on things. But it didn't sit right with me. The prints looked fresh. That night I had trouble sleeping. The air felt too quiet. Every sound from outside made me alert. The wind brushing the trees, a snap of a twig. I got up twice to check the windows. I told myself it was just my nerves adjusting to silence again after living in a city. The next morning I found something else. One of my food cans was missing. I had counted them before. I always do that sort of thing, habit, maybe paranoia, but I was sure I had 10. There were 9 now. I searched my bags and under the counter and even outside, thinking maybe I dropped it or misplaced it. Nothing. It was just gone. That's when the panic started creeping in. I didn't have a weapon beyond my hatchet and a small folding knife. I started carrying the hatchet on my belt. I felt stupid doing it, but I also didn't feel safe anymore. I checked the cabin all over again, under the bed, behind the furniture, up in the loft crawl space. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been inside while I was gone. That night, I moved the small table in front of the door and placed a tin cup on the doorknob. It would fall if the door opened. I didn't sleep much. I just stared at the ceiling and listened. At some point, I thought I heard soft footsteps on the porch, but I couldn't tell if it was real or my mind playing tricks. I stayed still and waited. Nothing else happened. In the morning, the cup was still hanging from the doorknob. I tried to convince myself I imagined the whole thing, until I stepped outside. There were more footprints now, this time clearer, more deliberate. They came right up to the porch steps, paused, and turned away. Someone had walked right up to the cabin sometime in the night. I checked the woods, scanned every tree, every shadow, trying to spot anything. But the forest just stared back at me, still and cold. That day, I packed all my gear and kept it close. I didn't want to leave just yet, but I didn't want to be caught off guard either. I left during the day to get more water and collect dry wood, but I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole time. Something about the woods felt wrong now. Too quiet, too still. When I got back, something else had changed. There was a dead bird on the porch. Its neck was twisted, and it had been placed carefully right in the center of the step, like a message. I didn't know what it meant. I just knew I didn't want to stay another night. I stuffed everything into my pack and decided I'd walk back to my car before dark and just sleep in the back seat if I had to. I didn't care about the rest of the rental period. I didn't even want my deposit back. I just wanted to go. I hiked back fast and reached the car before dusk. I felt safer inside it, like I had a layer of protection again. I drove until I reached a motel about 2 hours away and stayed there that night. When I got back home a few days later, I didn't tell anyone about what happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The missing food, the footprints, the dead bird. A week later, I got curious and did a deep search on the rental property. I found nothing official, but a few old posts on obscure forums mentioned a similar cabin. Some people had stayed there before. A few said it felt off. One mentioned hearing breathing outside the walls at night. Another said she left early after someone knocked on the window in the middle of the night but ran when she shined a light outside. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it made me realize something. That cabin wasn't abandoned. It was shared by someone who lived in the woods, someone who didn't want to be seen, someone who watched, and I had stepped into their space without knowing it. They didn't attack me. They didn't try to hurt me. They just showed me they were there, and that was enough. That was the scariest part of it all. Not knowing who they were, but knowing they were real, and they were watching me the whole time. I had no real plan when I decided to rent the cabin. It was more like I just couldn't take the noise anymore. The city, the job, the constant pings and buzzing from my phone. I was starting to feel like my mind was boiling. I wanted to be alone somewhere quiet for a while. No phones, no internet, no traffic, no people. Just silence, just space. I found the cabin listed on a small local website that didn't even have ads. Just a plain, old-looking page with a few photos and a phone number. The place was in the hills outside of a tiny town I had never heard of, past a few dirt roads and on the edge of a big stretch of pine forest. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin. One floor, a porch, a wood stove, and nothing around it but trees and dirt. It looked old but solid, peaceful. I booked it for 4 weeks and paid in full. I packed light, just clothes, dry food, a few tools, a cheap axe I bought last minute, and some books I figured I'd never actually get around to reading. I left my laptop behind. I turned off my phone as soon as I got off the main road and stuffed it into my glove box. No music, no GPS, just old printed directions I'd written down the night before. It was late afternoon by the time I found the turnoff. The road narrowed and twisted through tall, dark pine trees, and the gravel under my tires popped and cracked as I drove slowly up the slope. The trees got denser the deeper I went. I saw a few deer on the way. A fox darted across the path once. No houses, no mailboxes, no fences, just forest. When I finally reached the clearing, I stopped the car and just sat for a moment with the engine running. The place looked exactly like the pictures. Maybe even better. It was surrounded by silence. There were no wind chimes, no lawn decorations, no garbage cans, nothing that said a person had been there recently. Just an old wooden cabin tucked beneath the trees, slightly tilted from age, but strong. I turned off the engine and got out. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not just quiet, heavy. It felt like the air itself was pressing down on everything. I could hear my own footsteps crunching the dry needles and twigs underfoot. I could hear the soft creak of the trees swaying even slightly. I could hear a crow far off somewhere to the north. That was it. Inside the cabin, it smelled like dry wood, old fabric, and dust. Not in a bad way, just untouched. The air was still. The place had only one bedroom, a small kitchen with a hand pump for water, a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a faded green armchair next to the wood stove. The bedroom had a single bed with an old wool blanket and a stiff, narrow pillow. There was a bookshelf in the corner with a few old mystery novels and maps rolled up on the lower shelf. No bathroom, just an outhouse a little ways into the trees. That part didn't bother me. I was looking to get away from comfort. I unloaded my stuff and sat on the porch for a while, staring at the trees. The pines around the cabin weren't like the ones I remembered from hiking trips in the past. These were old, wide, and blackened at the base. Their lower branches were mostly dead. It made the whole area feel darker than it should have been, even in daylight. The clearing wasn't really open, just a small circle where the trees gave a little space. That first night was the quietest I had ever experienced in my life. There were no passing cars, no voices, no dogs barking in the distance, just wind and tree creaks. I made a fire in the wood stove and boiled some canned soup. Ate in silence. I sat in the green chair for hours doing nothing, just sitting. At some point, I fell asleep with my head tilted back. The days that followed blended together. I would wake up late, make oatmeal or canned food, walk into the woods a little, chop some wood, read a bit. But mostly I just sat. I wasn't thinking about anything. I wasn't planning anything. I just wanted to not feel like I had to do something every minute. By day 5, I started noticing small things. The first was the cigarette butts. I don't smoke, never have. But on the third morning, I found 2 fresh cigarette butts near the side of the porch. Still clean and dry, not old and stained. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it. They weren't hidden or deep under the leaves. They were just there, plain on the dirt and pine needles. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't like that, but I told myself maybe they were old, and I had missed them earlier. Maybe the last person who stayed here smoked and flicked them there. Maybe a squirrel or wind moved them into view. Maybe anything. That night I locked the cabin door, even though it had no real lock, just an old hook latch. I shoved one of the chairs under the knob too, just for the feeling of safety. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to little sounds. Snaps in the woods, scrapes, maybe just animals. I told myself that again and again. Animals. On the 6th day, I noticed footprints. They were light, like someone walking in worn-down shoes. Not boots. They came from behind the outhouse and curved around toward the back of the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine, but the size was wrong. Too narrow, and I always took the path from the porch to the outhouse. These came from the trees. They were fresh. The dirt was dry and loose, and these prints were sharp and crisp like someone had stepped just this morning. I didn't feel right after that. The stillness that had felt peaceful at first now felt suffocating. I couldn't hear birds anymore. The wind felt colder. I started glancing over my shoulder every few seconds when I walked anywhere. I even started peeking out the windows every hour. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling. On the 7th night, something tapped on the wall behind the bed. It was light like a finger, once, then silence. I froze. My back stiffened, and I didn't breathe. I waited. A full minute passed. Then it tapped again. 2 times this time. Then silence again. I sat up, slowly, and leaned to look out the small side window. Nothing. Just trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair with the axe on my lap, staring at the door. I didn't know what I was expecting. Part of me thought maybe I was just tired, paranoid, alone too long. But I knew I wasn't imagining the footprints, or the cigarette butts, or that soft tapping. The next morning, I packed my things. I wanted to leave. I was done. I didn't care if I wasted the rest of the rental. I didn't care about getting my money back. I just wanted to be back on a paved road, in cell service, near people. I loaded everything into the car fast, didn't even make breakfast. I slammed the trunk shut and jumped into the driver's seat. I turned the key. The engine clicked. Again, nothing. I opened the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I checked what I could. The battery looked fine. The connections were tight. Nothing looked loose or unplugged, but the car wouldn't start. I tried again. Same result. It wasn't dead. It just wasn't starting. As if someone had done something small and precise. Just enough. That was the first time I really felt scared. I grabbed the axe and the canteen and started walking. I figured I could hike back to where I had cell service, about 8 miles, maybe less. The air felt strange again. Not cold, just still. No birds, no wind, no bugs. I felt exposed walking on the narrow path, like every tree was hiding someone. About 20 minutes into the hike, I found something that stopped me cold. A shirt, my shirt, one I hadn't even worn yet, folded neatly and placed on a stump right beside the trail. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. Not even close. Someone had been inside the cabin, not just walking around it. Inside. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anyone, but I felt it. That crawling feeling on the back of your neck, the one your body knows before your brain does. I didn't keep walking. I turned around and went straight back to the cabin. It wasn't logical, but some part of me thought it was safer there than in the woods with someone who had been inside my cabin, walking near me at night, tapping on walls and folding my clothes. Back at the cabin, I locked the door again, shoved both chairs under the knob, dragged the dresser in front of it. I closed the shutters and sat in the corner farthest from the windows. I stayed like that until it got dark. That night, I heard something breathing outside the wall. Not walking, not scratching, breathing. Slow, steady. Then I heard footsteps. Not leaves crunching, but bare feet on the porch wood. Back and forth. Slowly. Then silence. Then a single knock on the door. Just one. Then more silence. I sat there, holding the axe tight, for hours. My arms went numb. I didn't sleep. The next morning, the car started. Just like that. It roared to life like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't question it. I drove. I didn't stop in the small town. I didn't stop for gas until I hit a highway with billboards and traffic. When I got home, I took every piece of clothing out of the bag and burned it in a metal bin behind my building. I never went back. A few weeks I needed a break from everything. The noise, the pressure, the endless sound of car horns, alarms, the low mechanical hum of air conditioning units outside my apartment. Even when it was quiet, it wasn't really quiet. There was always something, the distant thump of bass from someone's speaker, the buzz of my phone, the constant artificial presence of other people. I hadn't had a single day to myself in over 3 years. Not really. So when my vacation days stacked up to the point where my job told me to either use them or lose them, I decided to disappear for a while. I looked up remote cabin rentals in the mountains, somewhere far from highways, towns, any crowds. I didn't want a luxury cabin with Wi-Fi and a TV. I wanted a small place with wood walls, a basic fireplace, no cell signal, and nothing but trees outside every window. I found one that looked like what I needed. A man named Ed listed it on a forum, not even a major rental site, and it didn't even have that many photos. He said it was built in the late 80s, in a deep patch of forest in the Pacific Northwest. It had running water from a tank, solar panels that powered a few dim lights, a wood stove, and no plumbing beyond a composting toilet. No reception, no GPS signal, just coordinates and a warning. Bring everything you need, don't expect neighbors, and don't leave the trail in the woods around the cabin unless you know what you're doing. That sounded perfect to me. I packed food for 10 days, some tools, matches, a camping knife, a solar-powered battery pack, and an old GPS unit. I downloaded offline maps to my phone even though I knew I wouldn't have signal. I also brought a basic first aid kit, a good flashlight, and my sleeping bag even though the place had a mattress. It was a long drive from the city. I left early in the morning and didn't get to the turnoff road until late in the day. The last part of the trip was on a thin, deeply rutted dirt trail barely wide enough for one car. No lights, no road signs. I watched the sun vanish between the pines. Then a soft blue-gray twilight filled the truck as I crept forward. After about 5 slow miles, I saw the cabin. It looked older than in the pictures. It was small, square, and the wooden siding had turned gray from weather. The roof sagged a little in the middle but looked solid enough. The windows had those old-school single panes, the kind that fog up easily. There was a woodpile stacked under a covered lean-to and a water tank elevated off to one side. The porch creaked when I stepped on it. I unlocked the door with the key that had been mailed to me. No digital lock, and stepped inside. The air was musty, dry, and smelled like old cedar and dust. There were no bugs or animals inside, though, which surprised me. I set my bags down, stretched, and walked through the place. It was one big room with a small sleeping area and a curtained-off space with the compost toilet. The only furniture was a table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, a small cabinet with pans and utensils, and a low shelf with some old books and a few candles. Outside, the forest pressed in on all sides. Tall trees, dense underbrush, no neighbors, no other lights, no hum of traffic, no sound but the wind in the leaves and the occasional bird call. That first night, I lit a candle, ate a cold can of chili, and sat by the window, looking out at the dark line of trees. I didn't realize how much I missed this kind of silence. Not the city's version of silence, real silence. The kind that makes your ears ring a little because there's nothing to hear but your own breath. I fell asleep early, wrapped in my sleeping bag on the cabin's mattress. I woke up once to pee, and the air was cold enough that my breath came out in misty clouds. I used the compost toilet, added wood to the stove, then crawled back into the warmth of the bag and drifted off again. The first 3 days were perfect. I hiked the trails around the cabin. They weren't marked, but the main one was clear enough to follow for at least a few miles in each direction. I didn't go too far, just far enough to feel like I was away from everything. I cooked simple meals, read some of the old books on the shelf, and chopped wood from the pile to keep the stove burning. There was an axe in a rack near the door, and a smaller hatchet that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. Each night I slept early. Each morning I woke with the sun. I didn't think about work. I didn't check my phone. I didn't care what was happening in the world. I just listened to the forest. I heard birds, insects, the sound of branches creaking in the wind. I heard small animals moving in the brush now and then, but never saw anything bigger than a raccoon or maybe a coyote off in the distance. On the 4th morning, things changed. I was sitting on the porch drinking instant coffee when I noticed something odd in the tree line. It wasn't clear at first, just a shape, something that didn't match the rest of the woods. It wasn't moving. I stared at it for a while. It looked like it could have been a log, but the angle was off, too vertical. I walked out a little closer, maybe 15 feet from the porch, just to get a better look. As soon as I stepped forward, I realized the shape was gone. I stood there for a few minutes, staring. Nothing moved. No sounds beyond the usual forest ones. I figured maybe it had just been the lighting, or maybe a stump that I saw from a strange angle. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing there. That evening, I stayed inside. I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do the previous nights. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even another hiker, but I hadn't seen anyone else for days, and the cabin was 5 miles from the nearest main road. There was no reason for anyone to be here unless they knew it was here. The next day, I checked the trail heading east. I brought my small GPS unit just to be safe, marked the cabin's coordinates, and followed the trail for about 2 miles. Nothing unusual. The trees were normal, thick with moss in places. I didn't hear anything strange. I even started to feel like I had imagined the thing I saw the day before. But when I got back to the cabin, something was off. The hatchet was missing. I always kept it in the same place, on the floor next to the woodpile inside. It was gone. The larger axe was still there. Nothing else seemed out of place. The door had been locked when I returned. No signs of forced entry, no damage, but the hatchet was gone. I searched the cabin. I looked outside. I walked around the building. Nothing. No tracks. No drag marks. Nothing in the dirt or pine needles to show anyone had been there. I thought maybe I had left it outside after chopping kindling, but I always put it back in the same place. Still, I tried to convince myself I had made a mistake. Maybe I left it somewhere on the trail, or maybe it fell and I didn't notice. That night, I kept the axe next to me while I slept. I started waking up at odd hours. Once at 1 a.m., then again around 3 a.m. Each time, I felt like something had made a sound just outside. Not a branch falling or a small animal, something heavier. Something that moved carefully, like it was trying not to be heard. I stayed still, listening, but never heard anything again after that first faint sound. On the 6th day, I found footprints behind the cabin. They weren't mine. They were wide, heavy, and spaced further apart than my own steps. They came from the woods, looped behind the water tank, and stopped near the back window. Then nothing. No returning trail, no exit steps, just stopped. I stared at them for a long time. They were clear enough to make out the treads, boots. Not hiking shoes, not sneakers, thick soles. Deep impressions like the person weighed a lot or was carrying something heavy. I looked up at the window they stopped below. It was too high to see into from the ground, unless someone stood on something or was unusually tall. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lights off and sat near the window with the axe on my lap. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. Just the usual darkness and the wind in the trees. But I had that same feeling, like I was being watched. I sat in that same spot until the sky lightened and the birds started calling again. On day 7, I hiked west along the trail, further than I had gone before. I needed to clear my head, or maybe find some evidence that there were other people out there. After about 3 miles, I found something that made my stomach drop. A campfire site, long cold, with a few rusted cans, scraps of plastic, and a bundle of zip ties, just laying on the ground near a half-collapsed tarp. There were bones, too. Small ones. Looked like maybe from a raccoon or a dog. Picked clean. I didn't know if it was old or recent. Could have been there for a year. Or a week. But it felt wrong. The whole area felt wrong. Like someone had used it as a base camp, but not for hiking or camping. More like a hideout. I didn't stay long. I marked the spot on the GPS, took a photo with my phone just in case, and turned back. That evening, I came back to find the cabin's front door slightly open. I had locked it before I left. I was sure of that. Inside, nothing looked out of place except the axe was gone. The blankets on the bed were slightly rumpled, not the way I had left them. I felt the sheets. They were cold. No one had been lying. It started because I needed to finish something, not something small either. I'd been working on a big land development report for almost 2 months, and it was due in a week. I was behind, tired, and burned out. The city noise wasn't helping me focus. My phone kept ringing, emails wouldn't stop, and my neighbors were doing some kind of renovation that had their power tools going every morning before I even had coffee. I couldn't think straight in that place anymore, so I decided to get away somewhere quiet. I found a cabin online, remote, private, simple. The kind of place nobody would bother me. No cell service, no internet, just peace and time. The cabin was up in the northern hills, about 4 hours from where I lived. The listing said it was used mostly by hunters and hikers, but it had a desk, a bed, a wood stove, and a small generator for a few lights and the refrigerator. It sounded perfect. I packed all the things I thought I'd need. Clothes for a week, food, my laptop, 2 power banks, and all my printed research papers. I left early on a Sunday morning and didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just wanted to disappear and work. The drive was peaceful at first, just long roads and tall trees. About 3 hours in, I hit a gravel path that twisted deep into the woods. The road wasn't maintained well. It had potholes and dips that slowed me down to a crawl. I hadn't seen a single car or person since I left the highway. Eventually, the trees started to thin out, and I reached a clearing. The cabin stood at the center, plain wood walls, a tin roof, and a front porch with a single rocking chair. There were no other buildings around. No signs of other people. Just the cabin, surrounded by trees that seemed to go on forever. I got out, stretched my legs, and looked around. The air smelled fresh, cleaner than I was used to. The wind moved through the trees, and I could hear birds, but otherwise, it was silent. I walked inside and checked everything. It looked just like the photos. Small kitchen with a propane stove, a wood-burning heater in the corner, 1 bed, and a small table with a chair next to a window. There were a few shelves with canned goods and supplies, and a closet with extra blankets and tools. The bathroom was just an outhouse about 20 feet from the cabin. Basic, but I didn't care. I was here to work. I unpacked, made myself a sandwich, and sat at the desk. I opened my laptop and started going through my drafts. For the next few hours, everything felt fine. The quiet helped me focus. No cars, no people, no distractions. Just work. That night, I lit a few battery lanterns, heated up a can of soup, and ate while reading over my notes. I felt like I was getting somewhere. I stayed up until after midnight working before finally crawling into bed. It was cold, so I used 3 blankets. The quiet outside felt deeper at night, almost too deep, but I fell asleep fast. In the middle of the night, I woke up for no reason. I didn't hear anything loud, just a kind of sharp stillness. I stayed under the covers, listening. I thought maybe it was an animal outside, but after a while, I drifted back to sleep. The next few days were more of the same. I'd wake up, make coffee, sit at the desk, and work most of the day. I barely looked at my phone because there was no signal anyway. I made simple meals, took walks around the clearing, and sometimes chopped wood when I needed a break. The cabin was doing what I wanted, clearing my head. I made good progress. I finished the financial summary by the third day and started organizing my data tables and maps. But small things started to bother me. On the fourth morning, when I went out to the outhouse, I noticed a footprint in the mud just outside the door. It wasn't mine. It was a bit bigger and didn't match my boots. It looked fresh, like it had been made in the past day. It was just one print, though, and I figured maybe it was from the person who cleaned the place last or someone passing by before I arrived. Still, I looked around for more prints but didn't find any. I told myself it was nothing. That evening, I stepped outside to get firewood and felt like I was being watched. I turned around, scanned the trees, but saw nothing, just dark trunks and branches. The sun was setting, and the wind had picked up. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next night, I heard something outside. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed when I heard a crunch, like leaves being stepped on. Then another. I sat up and listened hard. There was no wind at that point, just the sound of something slow, like someone walking. I didn't have a gun or anything for protection, just a hatchet I kept by the woodpile. I stayed inside, holding my breath. The sound didn't come closer. After maybe 2 minutes, it stopped completely. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked the area around the cabin. I walked in a full circle around it. I saw a few disturbed leaves, but no clear prints. Maybe it had been a deer. Maybe I'd imagined it. But that wasn't the last time. On the 6th day, I walked down a path behind the cabin I hadn't tried before. It led downhill toward a shallow creek. I followed the water for a while, just enjoying the break. I was probably a mile from the cabin when I saw it. An old campfire ring made of stones. Some of the ashes looked fresh. There were 2 empty beer cans nearby and a broken folding chair half buried in leaves. I hadn't seen a single person all week, and now this. It didn't look abandoned. The fire had definitely been used recently. I walked back fast and locked the cabin door behind me. I started feeling like maybe I wasn't alone out here. That night, I barely worked. I kept checking the windows and listening for sounds. Nothing came, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, something was missing. I always kept a red thermos on the porch with my coffee in it. I'd drink from it while chopping wood. That morning, it was gone. I looked all over the porch, around the yard, and even inside. I was sure I'd left it on the porch table. It wasn't heavy, could have fallen or rolled off, but I didn't find it anywhere. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. On the tree closest to the porch, there were scratch marks. Not claw marks, scratches that looked like they were made with a knife. They were shallow, diagonal cuts, about shoulder height. I touched them. They were recent. The bark was still flaking. I went back inside and locked the door. By now, I was sleeping with the hatchet next to me. I started stacking things in front of the door at night. My suitcase, a chair, whatever I could move. I wasn't getting much work done anymore. I just wanted the week to end so I could leave. But the worst night was the last one. I had packed up most of my things already. It was Friday night. I was going to leave early in the morning. I didn't plan to sleep much. I wanted to be ready to go as soon as the sun came up. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer. I heard them circle the cabin slowly. Leaves crunching, branches snapping underfoot. Then I heard something drag across the sidewall. A slow, scraping sound. Not an animal, not a deer, something deliberate. I held my breath and stayed completely still. Then, I heard something thud against the porch, like someone stepping up onto it. Another step. I grabbed the hatchet, sat up, and stared at the door. I couldn't see much, but I heard the floorboards creak outside. Then, nothing. Total silence. I sat there in the dark, frozen. I didn't move for an hour. I just waited. No more sounds came. I don't know if they left. I don't know if they stayed out there watching. When dawn came, I threw everything into my bag, unlocked the door slowly, and stepped out. The porch was empty. The yard was quiet. I didn't check anything. I didn't eat or make coffee. I just got into my car and left. The drive back felt longer than it should have. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me on the road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Once I had cell service again, I texted a friend and told them I'd been in the woods working. I didn't explain much. When I got home, I unpacked and checked through my things. That's when I realized the red thermos wasn't missing. It was in my car trunk, but I know I didn't put it there. It had been on the porch that morning. I hadn't touched it in 2 days. I didn't go back to that cabin. I didn't leave a review. I never contacted the owner. I finished my report from home. Sometimes I still think about it. I wonder if someone lives out there in the woods, watching the cabins, waiting for people to show up alone. I don't have proof. Nothing happened. Nothing definite. But something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And I don't think I was ever really alone out there.